At 21, you spend your free time jamming on the drums with your best friends in your heavy metal band, while also enjoying moments with your new girlfriend. One day, your girlfriend isn't feeling well, so you head out to grab her something to eat, hoping it'll lift her spirits. But that was the last time Matt was seen. He vanished during that brief trip, and now I'm here to tell you what really happened to him. Matthew Robert Landry was born October 26, 1987, to Doreen and Robert Bob Landry. Matt was the youngest of 5 children. He had 2 older sisters, Christina and Gina, and 2 older brothers, Christopher and Douglas. Matt Landry loved skateboarding. He was a jokester. He liked to play all kinds of pranks on his friends and make people laugh. He was the typical boy next door, with a little flair. His friends knew there would never be a dull moment hanging out with Matt because he would constantly keep you on your toes. His core group of friends were a group of guys that he started a band with, and they had been playing together for many years. He considered his bandmates his best friends. By the time Matt was 21 years old, he loved 2 things in life more than anything: his new girlfriend Francesca Bomarito and music, specifically playing the drums. Matt and his best friends had a heavy metal band, and they would frequently get together to jam out in one of the band members' basements. So they basically had a basement fan, and they were the happiest when they were playing music, especially Matt. Matt playing drums, and this guy has some serious talent. And although their band wasn't famous and they only played 1 paying gig, by 2009, they had big plans and even bigger dreams, especially for guys living in Chesterfield Township, Michigan. Today's case is taking us to yet another township, and it's in Michigan. Matt lived with his parents in Chesterfield Township, Michigan. Chesterfield Township is a charter township of Macomb County, and the population was about 34,000 back in 2009. It's north of Detroit, off of Anchor Bay, which is part of Lake St. Clair. Like many other townships, it consists of an area that has typical stores and restaurants, etc., but then it's surrounded by somewhat of a less built-up area. You can see it right here on the map. The middle section consists of all the businesses, and then just outside this line, there's more land and buildings. This is the area that Matt lived in with his parents. From what I could gather, I believe this may have been the home they lived in. It was a quaint little quiet neighborhood with houses pretty close together and close-knit. So, let's jump to the summer of 2009. Matt was 21, and he had just recently started dating Francesca. She also loved music and played the bass guitar. They had similar loves for movies and music and would spend hours watching movies at friends' houses. Although Matt had no trouble shining when he had drumsticks in his hands, he was a shy, quiet type of guy, more reserved than outgoing, a sweet, shy guy. Even when it came to getting into a relationship with Francesca, it started as a friendship. It was Francesca who really made the moves to make it more. She would invite Matt to come over and hang out, and he'd say yes. She would ask him again and again, and finally he decided to stay over one night. Everyone that knew Matt knew how much he cared about Francesca. His parents, Doreen and Bob, knew their son so well. They were very close to Matt, and they were in contact with him daily, especially his mom. He was a regular texter and caller, always keeping in touch with those he cared about, especially his best friends in his band, his mom Doreen, and now Francesca, his new girlfriend. Doreen knew this relationship was for real because Matt would just light up anytime he would mention Francesca's name. She lived about 20 minutes away from Matt in a town called Roseville. Both of them worked part-time jobs where their shifts varied. They could be on the clock until very late at night, with Francesca working at a restaurant and Matt at a pizza place called Dolly's Pizza, delivering pizzas about 8 minutes away from his house. Anytime they were not working, they would try to spend time together, even if it meant waiting up for the other's shift to end and having to start their hangout sessions late into the night or even the early morning after midnight. It didn't matter because they were in love and they wanted to be together whenever they could. On the afternoon of Saturday, August night, 2009, Matt had a session with his bandmates, and then he had to work a shift at Dolly's by the evening. Still working, Matt called his mom, worried he wouldn't be able to finish his shift because something was wrong with his green 2004 four-door Honda Accord. He told her that his car alarm kept randomly going off, which was very distracting while driving and to those on the road. So he asked her if she could swing by the house and grab her car so he could finish up his deliveries. And of course, she said yes. So he made his way over there, parked his car in the driveway, and took his mother's car back to Dolly's, using it for his deliveries until his shift ended later that night. It was close to midnight, and he was still waiting for Francesca to end her shift at the restaurant, so he went home to kill some time before they met up. It was around 2:30 in the morning when, while Doreen's husband Bob slept through a storm that was raging outside, Doreen was kept awake by the thunder and the bright lightning outside. She chose to open a book and read in the living room, leaving her husband Bob upstairs in bed sleeping. Matt was getting ready to leave for Francesca's house. He told his mom he was going to try to see what was wrong with his car before he left, so he went outside. While Doreen watched him from the living room window, she saw Matt walk around his car in the driveway, trying to figure out what to do. He knew the car alarm kept sounding off without warning, but they didn't know why. So his mom was actually hoping the alarm wouldn't start blaring right now because it was 2:55 a.m. She didn't want anyone in their quiet little neighborhood to be woken up by the alarm. But nevertheless, Doreen couldn't do much except watch her son as he tried to gently lift up the car hood just enough. Then he set the alarm off, just as she expected he would. He panicked, so he hopped into his car and sped off down the street to move his car out of the neighborhood and not wake anyone up. It was about time for Matt's girlfriend Francesca to finish her shift at the restaurant where she worked, so he just drove right to her place. Matt arrived at Francesca's with a bottle of wine in hand, and they stayed up late, having a really fun night together. But by the next morning, Francesca was not feeling well. This was a little disappointing because Matt had planned to take her to a backyard family barbecue later that afternoon, back at his parents' house. He really wanted her to meet his sister Gina's boyfriend. However, Matt was more concerned with caring for Francesca and nursing her back to health than the barbecue. Besides, he knew that Francesca wasn't going anywhere and would have plenty of other opportunities to meet his family. Her well-being came first. That was Matt's nature, to be the caregiver, which he probably got from his own mother, being so kind and loving as she was. So he made Francesca a hot bath, got her a cup of tea, and brought her a thermometer to take her temperature. He was just doing whatever he could as a caring boyfriend. After a little while, Francesca still wasn't feeling that great. She was running a fever, so Matt called his mom to let her know what was going on and even asked her, "What do you think I could do? Is there anything else I could do for Francesca?" His mom thought that Matt was doing everything he possibly could and just hoped that Francesca would feel better. Matt told his mom that Francesca was going to take a little nap, and when she woke up, they would both come over. Doreen was looking forward to it. She said what she does to all of her kids before ending each and every phone call with them, "I love you." Matt replied, "I love you too, Mom." Matt had to do some errands, so he figured he would get them done while Francesca slept. But before leaving, he asked her if she wanted anything, if she was hungry or wanted food. Initially, she accepted the offer, but then she soon realized her stomach wasn't ready for food, so she declined. She decided to take that nap, and Matt left to go get some stuff done. He told her that he would come back when he was finished, then wake her up, and they would go over to his place for that family barbecue that evening. And when Francesca woke up, expecting to find Matt at her side, but as she looked around, he wasn't there. She looked at the time and realized it was much later than she expected, 5:47 p.m. She thought Matt would wake her up before 5, so they could make it to his parents' barbecue. So she was confused and called Matt's phone. She got no answer. She texted him, but still nothing. She was just sitting there, staring at her phone, waiting for something to happen. She figured maybe he was still out running errands, so she waited for him to call or show up. But while doing so, she fell back to sleep. Meanwhile, back at Matt's parents' house, the barbecue had already begun. Doreen had noticed that her son and his girlfriend hadn't made it, but she just figured Francesca ended up too under the weather to attend and didn't think much else of it. Who would? You don't expect anything out of the ordinary to be wrong just because your 21-year-old son and his girlfriend don't show up to a barbecue after telling you they may not make it. But where was Matt? That's the question his family and loved ones would soon be asking each other. Francesca woke up yet again and started to worry because Matt continued to ignore her calls and not get back to her, which was highly unlike him. He was in constant contact with her and others, and he would always answer. If he didn't, he would call right back within just a few minutes, not hours. It was 7:31 p.m, no Mavu. When she called him again, with no answer. No text back, nothing. All kinds of thoughts were going through her mind because you don't immediately go to thinking something bad is happening. The initial thought can be that it's a person's choice not to answer. They're too busy, mad at you, or even in the case of a couple, maybe they're with someone else. So, it's frustrating. You care about this person and you want to know what's going on. By 9:01 p.m., Matt was still not answering Francesca's calls. So she started to think of something more sinister as an explanation. Now she was feeling very worried about Matt's well-being. As I said, you go through those stages, you're frustrated, you're angry, and then you start getting worried. Then you almost get sick to your stomach with worry, just wondering what in the world is going on. And you freak out. She started thinking maybe he got into a car accident, or his car got stuck in a ditch. After all, his car was giving him issues the past few days. Francesca's mind could not stop thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. She did not know what else to do, so she started to contact local hospitals and police departments to see if anyone matching Matt's description was there. But they didn't have anyone matching the information about Matt, reported as being injured or in trouble. It wasn't only Francesca who was concerned about Matt. On Sunday evening, Matt's childhood friend Chris Emmerich, who was also in his band, was concerned. He was in constant contact with his friends. Matt suddenly turned radio silent. He was the type of person who would text his friends all day long, hourly. So Chris was concerned and actually got in his car, starting to drive the route he knew Matt would typically take, thinking that he would find Matt's car stranded or wrecked on the side of the road. After trying to find Matt but having no luck, Chris contacted his mother, Doreen, around 9 p.m. to tell her he thought something was very wrong because he couldn't get a hold of Matt. His mom thought he was with his girlfriend, Francesca. And it's so important to have friends like this. Friends who know your routine, your character, your family, so they can quickly piece things together when something doesn't feel right. Doreen was immediately concerned when she figured out that Francesca hadn't heard from him either. In moments like these, I see a pattern. As humans, we want to do what we can with what we know. We want to use our expertise to help in some way, whether it's just to alleviate our fears or to dispel those bad thoughts. We take action. Matt's mother was a banker, so she got to work pulling up Matt's bank records to look at where he may have used his debit card last. Doreen was able to see Matt's debit card activity, but it did not alleviate her fears. She had been in the banking industry a long time and was very well versed in spotting fraudulent charges right away. Red flags started going up for her. There were 3 suspicious transactions made, 3 from the same location, back to back. All 3 were $100 withdrawals from an ATM, and it wasn't one close by. That was another red flag for her. These transactions were made from a gas station on 7 Mile Road in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit streets use a mile road system. One of the most famous is 8 Mile Road, where Marshall Mathers, aka Eminem, was born. Rapper and videographer Darnell Williams said that 8 Mile is hugely popular because of the movie, but it is the last point before the suburbs. According to Darnell Williams, 7 Mile Road is the actual city of Detroit, and the 7 Mile Road area at this point was overrun with gangs, drugs, and violence. Police officers in this area didn't even conduct night patrols anymore because it was so dangerous. Instead, bounty hunters were hired to deal with the criminals. Doreen's stomach twisted into knots. What was her son, who had just been nursing his sick girlfriend back to health, doing near 7 Mile Road in Detroit? It was at least a 30-minute drive out of the way from anywhere she knew he would normally go. She was at a loss, trying to figure out why he would be in such a scary part of town, with burned-out houses littering the area, which was basically a death trap. Doreen also knew how careful Matt was with his money. Matt would avoid ATMs with processing fees if he could. He would have gone to his local bank. he would not have made 3 withdrawals back to back, costing him an extra $6. She also checked her son's phone records and saw that the last time he actually used his phone was at 4:15 p.m. on Sunday. After that, it was shut off and never back on. That was very concerning. By the next morning, Monday, August 11, Doreen and Bob decided they needed to go down to the local Chesterfield Township Police Department and report Matt missing. By this time, most of Matt's close friends, including his girlfriend, Francesca, had spoken to Matt's parents, so Doreen was able to give the police all the information they had. From the last calls Matt made from his phone, according to his phone records, to the calls made to him by his friends and Francesca, and the last place he was, which was at her place. She also gave them information about the bank transactions all the way out in Detroit. Now, what happens next? I understand that there are a lot of procedures and processes in place when police are contacted about somebody being missing, especially when it's an adult. And in this case, Matt was 21 years old, and they're only working with the information they have. But it seems like in a lot of cases, the cops are very judgmental. That's their first response. We've heard this time and time before. He's an adult, he's a grown man. Like it matters if you're a man or a woman, that it should be taken less seriously if you're a man, as though a man can take care of himself. Leave him alone, type of thing. They tell Doreen and Bob that Matt is a grown man who can make his own choices, and he was free to leave town, even though he lived with his parents. He didn't have to let them know where he was going. They also tell Matt's parents they need to wait, that it was very common for a 21-year-old to get drunk or high all night and then pass out at a friend's house and not call until the next day. Now mind you, he actually hadn't been seen since Sunday evening. And as far as anyone close to him was concerned, he wasn't out partying. He was taking care of his girlfriend and running some errands and even planned to go to a family barbecue. So his parents were sitting there thinking, "No, you don't know our son." And we hear that a lot. They were like, "You don't know our son. You don't know what's going on here." And in this case, Doreen and Bob actually spoke up and said, "That's not our son. That's not what he would be doing. It's out of character." Especially not speaking to anyone for the rest of the entire day and not getting in contact with them by Monday when his phone was off. So the police finally give in, and they tell Matt's parents, "We'll go ahead and put Matt in our system." But another reason the Chesterfield Township Police weren't really taking it seriously was because it was out of their jurisdiction, so to speak. Matt lived in Chesterfield Township, but he was last seen in Roseville at Francesca's house. So his parents were told that they should be calling Roseville Police Department, and they had to wait 24 hours to make an official report. So that's what they did. They waited. Meanwhile, something else completely out of the ordinary was happening in another township, so close to Chesterfield. The Roseville PD got a call that a man had just tried to rob a bank in Harrison Township. It's 16 minutes south of Chesterfield and between Chesterfield and Roseville, and it got worse. Police were notified that a young woman, only 19 years old, almost lost her life. She was held at gunpoint, so they rushed over to find out what in the world was going on. This was highly unusual for this area. When the officers arrived, they found 19-year-old Sarah Maynard, shaken beyond belief, along with staff and customers. They were telling their terrifying stories about what just happened. Sarah Maynard was on her way to cash her very first paycheck. She had just started a new job at a dog kennel. She gets out of her car to enter the Flagstar Bank branch, and she felt like someone was watching her. We've all felt that strange feeling. She turns around and notices a man with sunglasses lurking behind her. While Sarah did feel creeped out, this wasn't that uncommon, so she shrugged it off and just told herself she was being overdramatic. While she ignored this man, she walked into the bank, handed her check to the teller, and just as she did so, Sarah felt a cold metal muzzle of a gun being pushed into the back of her head with force. CCTV footage from inside this bank captured the entire event, and it is chilling to watch. As he held the gun to Sarah with his other hand on her throat, the man told her to give him $50,000 or he would kill her. This is completely terrifying. An ordinary trip to the bank and your life hangs in the balance. The teller explained to the man that she did not have that much cash, but the robber continued to threaten Sarah's life. So the teller, eventually desperate, opened the drawer and gave him everything she had. After this, the man let go of Sarah, and she turned around. She saw that the man who was threatening her was the same one who had been staring at her as she entered the bank. She was now face to face with this dangerous man. He wasn't done either. He walked around the bank, collecting wallets and cash from all of the terrified customers. He continued to threaten their lives, waving and pointing his gun at them. Can you even imagine the fear? It's unbelievable, and it's not over yet. What happens next is even more horrifying. He goes right back over to Sarah with his gun in hand, and he threatened her again. He told her to come with him, or he would kill her. This next part is so important. Please listen to this. Listen to what Sarah did. Sarah bravely refused. She sat down on the ground and told him no, she wouldn't move. She used all of her force to stay right there, glued to that bank floor no matter what. With time going by, the frustrated bank robber tried to pull her up repeatedly and repeated his demands over and over. But eventually, he gave up and fled. When the Harrison Township investigators examined the footage and saw what this suspect was capable of, they were stunned. This man was brazen, bold, and not afraid. When burglars walk into banks, they usually try to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. They'll just leave a note with the teller. But the Flagstar bank robber didn't seem to care, and the investigators believed that this robber would have done anything necessary to get what he wanted. They were surprised that he left Sarah behind and that he hardly even disguised himself. The investigator said that what Sarah did saved her life. That was a very important lesson for me to take away here. Sarah was interviewed later, and she said that, either way, something bad could have happened, but she didn't want to find out what if she went with him. At least if he decided to hurt her at the bank, the videos and the eyewitnesses would know what he did. She made the right choice. It won't always end positively like it did for Sarah, but it was an important takeaway. So you might be wondering what Sarah has to do with Matt and his case. Well, for one thing, these township police departments and the Roseville Police Department are now dealing with two unusual reports: Matt being missing and the suspicious ATM transactions, and now this bank robbery is so close in proximity. So it does correlate to them, coupled together in such a short time frame and proximity-wise. They needed to keep both of these incidents in mind as they went forward. And it's a very good thing they did, because I'm going to tell you what happens next and how this all connects. Now at that 24-hour mark, the Landrys, along with Francesca, decide it's time to make that official missing persons report, because they had to wait that designated time frame. We've all heard this. So on Monday evening, the 11th, they still kind of gave them the same song and dance at the Roseville Police Department that Chesterfield did. But thankfully, there was one detective, Scott Blackwell. He was overhearing everything that was going on, and when they were done speaking with an officer, Detective Blackwell wanted to talk to Doreen. She was the one who went out of her way to get all the records, Matt's debit card transactions at the gas station on 7 Mile Road in Detroit. She told him that Matt used his debit card at Quiznos Subs in East Point at 2:33 p.m. That was the very last transaction before all of the strange withdrawals. The Quiznos made sense to Doreen because it's somewhere that he would eat frequently and it was close by. But the other transactions made an hour later, all the way in Detroit, were not normal. I mean, all of Matt's money had been withdrawn from his account, and even though his parents were hoping it was him who made these transactions, it really just did not make sense. So Detective Blackwell saw the red flags go up, and he was interested in this case. He told them that he would do whatever he could to try to figure out what was going on. Detective Blackwell flagged Matt's green Honda as a wanted vehicle on the Law Enforcement Information Network. Then he went to the Sunoco gas station because he wanted to find out if they had video surveillance cameras that would help him right away. Because if Matt was on video, it would ease his parents' minds. Maybe he did leave town, but if it was someone else on those videos, then they needed to look into this further. Detective Blackwell got to the gas station and began talking with the owner, Moses Rahim. Detective Blackwell requested to view the CCTV footage from the security system shortly before 3:30 p.m. on Sunday, August 9th, when Matt's debit card transactions occurred. It was actually pure luck that Moses Rahim was able to help. If they had needed footage of that ATM area just 3 days before this happened, there wouldn't be any. He told Detective Blackwell he was lucky because only 3 days ago, Moses had gone to Sam's Club specifically to buy a high-end security camera to capture a blind spot that his old camera didn't catch, right where the ATM was. For some reason, Moses was not only compelled to buy a new system to include that spot, but he also felt the urge to set it up immediately. It was the weekend when he purchased it, and Moses' son, Issa, tried to convince him that they didn't need to install the camera. He suggested, "Let's do it on Monday." However, Moses was adamant that they replace the system that day. And thankfully they did, because what they captured on video took Matt's case in a totally different direction. Although Detective Blackwell felt lucky to have found this footage, watching it gave him a really bad feeling at 3:30 p.m., about an hour after Matt's card had been used at the Quiznos subs. Moses Rahim's state-of-the-art Sam's Club security camera captured someone other than Matt using Matt's debit card at the gas station. And while Detective Blackwell dreaded having to tell Doreen and Bob Landry what he had just seen, he didn't hesitate to call them and let them know it was not their son on that video. The Landrys were really hoping there would be a reasonable explanation for why Matt wasn't in contact with them. They were even hoping that the police were right, that maybe he was high or drunk and passed out somewhere. But Detective Blackwell had evidence that pointed to something way more sinister. And I'm going to get back to that and everything else that was on that video, because Blackwell had to wait to get a copy of it. By the next day, on Tuesday, August 12th, the family was passing out flyers with Matt's photo and all of his information on it. They even checked auto repair stores, thinking that maybe his car was broken down, as he attempted to buy items to fix it. Francesca had resorted to checking dumpsters, and it's sad, but she was so desperate to find out what happened to the man she loved. She was driving from Roseville south into Detroit, checking along every major road in any store or restaurant that had dumpsters behind them. And as Francesca dug through trash, she could not believe that this is what her life had become. Francesca and Matt were watching movies and making plans for their future just a few days before this, and now he was missing, and she was searching through the garbage for his dead body, which was unreal. And what happens next was also some kind of luck. Or maybe the fact that both the police and Matt's loved ones were both retracing his assumed steps. But Francesca saw a lot of police activity right when she was about to make it into Detroit and closer to 7 Mile Road. She saw cop cars just whizzing past her with their sirens blaring, and she decided to follow them. It was in this approximate area, Rossini Drive, and obviously the police had found something big. Francesca hoped it wasn't Matt's body, and as she got closer, she didn't see Matt, but she did see something familiar. It was Matt's green Honda Accord. It was abandoned on the side of the road on Rossini Drive and Hayes Street. It was around 4 miles away from 7 Mile Road, and only 2 minutes from the Sunoco gas station where those ATM transactions were made. Francesca knew it was Matt's car right away, so she got out of her car and made her way over to the police officers. She was so determined and brave, and she was able to explain everything, who she was, and even able to put one of the officers on the phone with Matt's mom. And that's huge. And I'm going to tell you right now, Matt's loved ones were pivotal in solving this case. Some may argue they did more than the police so far. Matt's mom was the one pulling the bank statements and locating the gas station where suspicious transactions took place. And Francesca had her boots on the ground from Roseville into Detroit, looking for her boyfriend. She's now able to connect this officer to Matt's mom, Doreen, and he provides a clue. He tells her there are maps inside Matt's car in the passenger seat. At first, this wasn't something that seemed out of place. Matt was a pizza delivery driver. Doreen said it would not have been uncommon for him to use maps to make sure he found the correct locations. But then, I thought back to 2009. I'm pretty sure we had maps on our iPhones. However, when I Googled it, it turns out iPhones didn't have Apple Maps until 2012. However, they did have Google Maps, but I don't recall the accuracy of them. Could there be another reason for these maps to be in Matt's car? Matt delivered pizza locally, so unless he was trying to make his way well out of town, maybe it would be odd for him to have maps. The police towed the car to a garage at the Chesterfield Township Police Department for processing. By that night, Matt's face and story were all over the local news stations, along with Sarah Menard's hair-raising brush with death at the Flagstar Bank. And watching the news that night was one of the investigators from the Roseville Police Department, Lieutenant Raymond Blarick. Now, this news report of the bank robbery showcased that horrific footage from the CCTV camera, including the robber with the sunglasses on and poor Sarah in his grasp. This case had nothing to do with the Roselle PD for now anyway, since it happened in Harrison Township. But it was shocking to him as a mere citizen of the area, and he was glued to the screen, taking in every detail. And good thing he was, because by the next day, he would be using that news segment to somehow connect the dots to form conclusions in Matt's case. Someone else from Matt's inner circle had become aware of the evidence in this case. It was Matt's dad's best friend, Christopher Manning. Hearing that his best friend's 21-year-old son had vanished, he was not just going to sit around and do nothing. Someone had to stay at the Landrys in case Matt called or came home. So Christopher took it upon himself to play detective. By 7 p.m., Chris and his brother were driving out to the location where Matt's car was found. These men were so brave. This area was residential in nature. Here it is on Google Maps. I'll give you an idea of where this took place. Keep in mind this is only 2 minutes away from 7 Mile Road. This is what the area looked like for the most part, and if you keep making your way down Hayes, you'll run into 7 Mile Road and the Sunoco gas station right here. Chris and his brother searched that area for about 90 minutes before they made their way up to that Sunoco gas station. Remember, the family had not seen the video because Detective Blackwell had to wait to get an official copy that he could retain as evidence. Then he planned to show them. Well, Christopher Manning was determined to see what was on the tape, and somehow they were able to convince Moses Rahim to show them the video. And he did. Here's what they saw. A guy in a white shirt with an orange baseball cap using the ATM. At one point, he turns and faces the camera, and that's when something unexpected happened. One of the cashiers that was working that night was watching the news and had just seen that bank robbery segment. Then he caught a glimpse of the guy on the ATM video. If Chris and his brother hadn't even come in there that night to watch it at that very moment, the cashier might not have seen this video. While he meets the connection between the guy in the bank video and the one on the ATM footage, he says, that is the same guy. And sure enough, Chris and his brother agreed. Not only that, this cashier gave them a name. He said this was a local guy who came in all the time, and he went by the name IHOP. He thought he might even be a gang member and told them that's pretty much all he knew. But that was a lot. It seemed like they were moving faster than the police at this point. On that same footage, they watched this guy purchase a white t-shirt, then take off his shirt and put the new one on. He walked out of the gas station and threw the shirt away in the dumpster on site. The cashier said this was the first time he had ever seen IHOP use an ATM. He always paid in cash, never with a card. So Chris immediately walks out. He goes to that trash, and he's astonished to find that the shirt was still inside. He collects it, and he and his brother go off to canvass the surrounding area, hoping to find Matt or more clues to his disappearance. Why stop now, right? They were on a roll. But it's dark, and these brothers didn't let that scare them. They went up and down 7 Mile Road into abandoned and burned-out houses, trying to see what they could find. Armed with only a flashlight and their sheer determination, they were even stopped by some of the locals, asking them, "What are you doing here?" They confidently told them they were working on a case involving the disappearance of a young man. The person left them alone, thinking they were actual police officers. That's the air they had about them, and maybe they were pretending to be officers. I'm not sure, but all I know is nobody bothered them after that. They kept at it until around 10:30 p.m., and then they made their way back to the Roseville Police Department to hand over the t-shirt they found. The next day, back at the same department, Lieutenant Raymond Blarick is starting his day. Now, he's the one I told you about who was watching the news with the bank robbery, and he was just a concerned citizen at the time. He didn't know that the next day he would be thrown into that very case. A call came in from a man who had just been carjacked at a Walmart parking lot on 12 Mile Road. Lieutenant Blarick was one of the people called out to the scene. The responding officers didn't see the suspect when they arrived in that Walmart parking lot, but the victim and his car, a red Honda Civic, were still there. The victim said a man came up to him as he was getting into his car after shopping. The guy took out a gun and told him to get out of the car and run. So he did what he was told, but to his surprise, he looked back and the gunman was not pulling away. He didn't know why, but he realized it was because the guy didn't know how to drive manual transmission. But there is a learning curve, and this guy never learned. He certainly didn't have time during a carjacking in broad daylight, so he fled on foot. But by that time, the owner of the Civic had already started calling 911. Well, guess what? One of the officers saw someone who looked nervous running through that parking lot, and as the person was running, a wig flew off of their head. Well, that was definitely something that piqued their interest, so they chased after him. As they got closer, the man threw a gun and a clip from out of his pocket, so police didn't even hesitate at this point. They tased the guy. Now he's under arrest, and Blarick gets a good look at him. He realizes this is the same man that he saw on that CCTV footage from the bank robbery. His name is Ihab Musalmani, but he goes by the street name IHOP. Blarick begins putting clues together, one being the green Honda that was found not too far from the Walmart the day before. Both were Hondas and involved in some type of crime. He wants to find out more, so he calls over to the Chesterfield Township Police Department. He's informed about the maps inside. Upon further inspection, a direct link is found. A literal X marks the spot. The map had an X on it, where the Flagstar Bank is located. He begins to think these incidents are all connected. Now he truly believes the carjacker from the Walmart may also have stolen Matt's car and perhaps harmed Matt or taken him somewhere. Sometimes, when these carjackings occur, the occupants are still in their vehicles. Armed with this new information, Blarick and another detective do exactly what Chris and his brother were doing the night before. They started canvassing the area where Matt's car had been found. They were hoping that Matt was still alive and being held somewhere against his will. But with 3 days having passed, the chances of Matt still being unharmed or alive were slim. That night, the Landrys are watching the news and they find out that the guy they know as IHOP from the ATM video has been arrested in connection with the Walmart carjacking. So, Doreen calls the Roseville Police Department and says, "The man who robbed the bank and is in your jail is the same man who used my son's ATM card, and my son is missing. You need to get someone in there to talk to him now." And again, Matt's family, they're the ones putting the heat on police and piecing all these things together. I can't even begin to imagine what it must have felt like for Matt's family. It's like all the signs were pointing to this guy, and yet it must seem like nothing was happening. You probably feel very helpless. Doreen was terrified because she saw that man holding a gun to Sarah in the bank, and she knew how dangerous he was. To think that this man somehow got a hold of her son's bank card, there were so many terrifying thoughts going through her mind. She shared all this with detectives. Meanwhile, Francesca and Gina, Matt's sister, are on the news pleading for someone to do something. They're also making a plea to the perpetrator saying, "Please, just bring Matt back." Gina even made a public post on Facebook telling local people to go down to the Roseville Police Department and put pressure on them to do something. To her surprise, a bunch of people did just that. They even showed up at midnight to support the Landrys. By the next day, Bob and Doreen went down there themselves to talk to detectives. What they didn't know was that the night before, after Blarick returned from searching those burned-out houses late into the night and early morning, he and his partner were already interviewing IHOP. Blarick's partner did all the talking at first, asking questions, hoping IHOP would confess to something in regard to Matt's case, but he was silent. Then, Blarick used a trick. He took a picture of Matt and put it in front of IHOP saying, "We found him." Now, he was lying, but Blerick wanted to analyze this man's reaction. He saw a look of shock come over his face, as though he had just seen a ghost, but he still remained silent. After some more questions, IHOP, whose real name is Ehab, did begin to speak, but all he said was, "I got no answer for that," and he said it at least a half a dozen times. At one point during the interview, he actually compared himself to Jesus, saying that they were going to find out the truth at the end. He claimed people didn't find out the truth about Jesus until the end, and that he would go to court to fight his case. But his coldness and heartlessness were apparent. He didn't have to speak any words for the detectives to feel that, just from his presence. Blerick relayed all of this information to the Landrys, and they were happy. They were happy that officers seemed to finally be taking their son's case seriously. There was nothing they could do but go back home and wait. Meanwhile, Gina was trying to keep people informed about Matt's story through Facebook. She gets a call from her best friend, and her friend says, "Gina, you better check your Facebook, ASAP." There was a message that came in from a woman that Gina used to go to high school with. The woman told her that her parents had called 911 on Sunday afternoon because they witnessed a carjacking, and it involved an older model green Honda. I was blown away by Matt's family being the ones piecing a lot of this evidence together. This happened in the city of East Point, which was just 4 minutes away from Roseville, where Matt was when he was last seen at Francesca's place, and where the Quiznos was. But it was where the carjacking occurred that made Gina's stomach turn. It happened behind the Quiznos, where Matt's debit card had been used last. This wasn't looking good. Gina immediately told Doreen, and they contacted Blerick with all this new information. Sure enough, a 911 call from that afternoon was found.
911 explain, please. Back of Quiznos, I'm not sure, but it looks like a robbery. You got a guy cornered over here. By the neck now. I think he's putting him in the trunk. They're beating him up now. Hurry!
They were actually listening to the voice of Lawrence Wada, who was literally giving the dispatcher a play-by-play of what was happening right in front of his eyes. But by the time the police arrived that afternoon, the car was gone and Matt was nowhere to be found. Here's what Detective Blerick was able to ascertain from the information provided by Lawrence. He was driving his GMC Suburban eastbound on 10 Mile Road with his wife and daughter. As he approached the Quiznos, he saw someone he described as a black male about 35 feet away, standing around the back of the store and kind of tucking something under his waist belt. The traffic began to move forward, and Lawrence drove closer to Quiznos to get a better look. Lawrence then told his wife, "I think that guy has a gun. Lock the doors." Lawrence could see 2 other males standing by the guy who looked like he had a gun. Lawrence saw a dark-haired white male with his hand draped over another white male who was standing near the green Honda. The vehicle's trunk was open, and they were facing the trunk lid. Lawrence said the black male stood about 10 to 15 feet away and continued to look up and down the streets. Lawrence turned into the parking lot of a store directly across from Quiznos and informed his wife that he was going to warn the Quiznos employees about the man behind their store with a gun. He was probably going to rob the store. However, as Lawrence, very brave by the way, got out to do just that, the man with the gun looked around and made direct eye contact with him. So Lawrence immediately headed back to his car and moved it to another parking lot across from Quiznos. Still, that's when he made the 911 call, telling them there was a man with a gun who looked like he might be robbing Quiznos. At that point, there were still 3 guys on the scene. One was inside the driver's side of a green Honda with his legs out of the door and the door open. The dark-haired white male had his hand over the top of the driver's door and one hand on the top of the roof, sort of blocking the driver inside. Blerick was almost positive that the driver was Matt Landry and that the guy with the dark hair was IHOP. They weren't sure about the third male at this point. But Lawrence went on to explain that the trunk was closed at this time. However, as you heard on the call, the man believed to be IHOP walked around to the trunk, opened it, and grabbed Matt by the neck. He put him in a headlock and attempted to drag him into that trunk. That was a really fit guy. I'm talking 6-pack abs or more. He obviously worked out. It wasn't just from his constant and impressive 200 beats per minute heavy metal music on the drums, he looked like he worked out. IHOP was unable to get Matt into the trunk, so he punched him and then tried forcing him into the driver's seat. And at this point, Lawrence was on the phone with 911, saying they're beating someone up. He said that all 3 men were inside the car, and then it sped off with a man matching IHOP's description at the wheel. Lawrence didn't just stay there. He followed the green Honda for several streets and a few turns before he lost sight of it. He kept relaying all of this information to the dispatcher as this played out. But I realized this was happening very fast, within just minutes. And that is why police did not find the car when they arrived. After gathering this new information, detectives went over to Quiznos to interview the staff that were working on Sunday, August 9th, 2009. Michael Sawyer was an assistant manager that day, and he was working with his coworker Jessica McKinney. They were both questioned about what they remembered from that day in regard to Matt Landry. Right away, Jessica let detectives know she knew Matt personally. She also took his order that day. But before Matt came in, there was an encounter with 2 other men that stood out. Michael said that before the men entered Quiznos, he saw them across the street in the plaza riding their bikes. A man he described as Arab American, wearing an orange baseball cap, who we know is most likely IHOP at this point, came in and asked if he could have a cup of water, which Jessica ended up helping him get. After he got the drink, he left the store with it. Shortly afterward, a young African-American male walked into the store, carrying the same cup, and asked for some water. Jessica showed him where to fill up his cup. After this, Jessica said Matt came into the store and she began to take his order. He specifically mentioned that his girlfriend wasn't feeling well, and he asked if Jessica knew any kind of sub or food that would make her feel better or would be easy for her to keep down if she was feeling sick to her stomach. He cared so much. He was so proud to have a girlfriend. It's like you want to tell everyone that you meet that you love someone or that you're loved by someone. I get it, and it hurts me to think about Matt doing this right before he's confronted by these 2 men. But Jessica proceeded to make 2 subs for Matt. He paid, and then he left. Michael said that about 10 minutes later, the East Point police officers arrived at that store, responding to a 911 call. After interviewing the workers at Quiznos, detectives made their way to the surrounding businesses, asking to view their security footage. They got a hit. A Marathon gas station near Quiznos said they had a camera, so they pulled the surveillance footage. Detectives combed through it, and sure enough, at 5 p.m. on Sunday, August 9th, 2009, they spotted the green Honda pull in. Now they already knew that IHOP was seen at 3:30 that day at the Sunoco, so this footage was after the ATM transactions. I'm so sick of calling him IHOP, I don't know why, so I'm going to call him IHAB, because that's his name. Ehab was seen on this new surveillance, pulling Matt's green Honda into the convenience store parking lot. He got out of the vehicle and entered the store. 2 females were inside the vehicle, but no Matt inside the store. Ehab and another guy appeared to be conducting some kind of transaction. Ehab looks as though he has a pistol concealed in his waistband. 20 minutes earlier, their surveillance video shows an unidentified black male subject at the same gas station wearing the same orange baseball hat that IHOB was wearing when he was speaking to the unidentified individual. So all this is starting to make sense, especially to Francesca once she gets the news. Matt had asked her if she wanted anything to eat before he left, and considering he got 2 subs, she knew that he had thoughtfully gotten her one, even though she declined his offer. Another thing is, she had a dream before Matt went missing that he was taken and dragged into the basement of someone's house, tied up to one of those vintage heaters. Now, she was beginning to wonder if that dream was actually a premonition. Matt's family was still hoping that he's alive. Maybe he's tied up somewhere, maybe he's being kept against his will, maybe he's at a crack house somewhere on 7 Mile Road. But they just hoped he was okay. 5 days had gone by, and finally, a task force was put together to go search those exact locations. All the departments came together: Chesterfield, Roseville, the East Point Department, in addition to the Detroit Police Department's gang unit, and Dearborn, Michigan, provided canines to this task force. They were on a mission to find Matt. Now there are hundreds of these burned-out houses in Detroit at this time. Many residents would beg the mayor to do something about this, to demolish them so they wouldn't attract vagrants, drug dealers, and crime. It was Thursday, August 13th. Lieutenant Blarick and his partner, Lieutenant James Noblesdorf, entered an abandoned, burned-down home on Madeline Street, near Monarch Street, just 1 block north of 7 Mile Road. This was 2 blocks away from their Humes family Sunoco gas station. This is the street they were on. It's a rough area. They had been confronted by drug dealers all day and users. They were trying to get information about Matt and whether anyone had seen him or knew a guy named IHOP. It was there, on the street, that Blarick had just found a shiny penny, heads up, outside the last house that they had just come out of. He felt like his luck was about to change. He had made a promise to Matt's family, as a father himself, that he would not stop until he found Matt. So he and his partner entered the house at 14711 Madeline Street. If you can even call this a house, because this structure didn't even have any walls that were completely standing up. The walls were just burned through. It was just a ton of debris, and only the metal frame was there. There was garbage just strewn around the lawn. It was set way back from the street, and it looked like it could come crashing down at any minute. Yet these men did not hesitate to venture inside. Look at this place. It's completely burned out. But it was what Detective Blarick saw when he stepped inside that made him keep going. Something out of place. A flip-flop in perfect condition. As he made his way deeper inside, that's when he saw what he feared. The body of a white male with the other flip-flop still on. It had only been 5 days, but with the smoldering summer heat, the condition of the body was much more decomposed than usual for such a short time frame. Lieutenant Blarick visually examined the remains and saw what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the head. They preliminarily identified Matt from photos that they had of him. They were certain it was him. He was transported to Wayne County Medical Examiner's office for a full autopsy, and using dental records, a medical examiner confirmed that they had found the body of Matt Landry. The most important thing they had to do right now was to inform the Landrys before the media arrived. Because when they radio something like this in, many news stations listen to their radio channels to be the first to cover a story. They sent the chief of police to Matt's family's home, and as soon as Doreen saw him at the door, she already knew the news that she was going to get. She didn't even want to hear it. But after she got the news and she finished crying, she said she went straight into the shower because she just wanted to feel like she was washing away this horrific reality. Dr. Lockman Sung, an assistant medical examiner in Wayne County, performed the autopsy on Matt. The manner of death was a homicide. The cause of death, gunshot wound to the back of the head with a slightly downward trajectory. The exit wound was to the front. Ihab Musulmani was only 17 years old when he was arrested and now charged with the murder of Matt Landry. He was from Libya. He was brought over to America at 10 years old and was living with relatives, but unfortunately he suffered from neglect and he was put in the custody of the state. After being tossed around to different foster homes, he finally ran away and began living on the streets, ultimately getting involved with gangs, selling drugs, and using crack cocaine, among other illegal substances. He resorted to a life of crime to satisfy his addiction. It's a sad story, but an even sadder one for the man that he was accused of killing, poor Matt Landry. Ihab pleaded not guilty to all the crimes, that bank robbery, attempted murder, and the murder of Matt, among other things. Now the thing is, it was pretty obvious that Ihab had done this. He had been seen on the bank cameras driving Matt's car on surveillance videos at the ATM, so those crimes were more of a slam dunk. However, there was no evidence linking him to Matt's murder, no gun, no bullets at the scene. However, there were 2 spent cartridges found, one near Matt's body and the other a few houses down in a driveway. But without anything to compare them to, they couldn't concretely connect him to Matt's murder. They needed more. They also weren't convinced he acted alone, since the eyewitnesses from Quiznos, both Lawrence, who made the 911 call, as well as the staff, said there were 2 males with Matt. They needed to track down the other one. I know this is a lot of information, but I want you to know the details. I want you to know who was responsible for this. And according to Matt's friends, 2 people had to be involved. Although Matt was considered a gentle giant, he could take down anyone, and he would easily have beaten a single attacker. But 2, that would be a little more difficult. One of his bandmates was the one who said this. He was 6 feet tall and 280 pounds, and he said confidently that Matt could lay him out. Detectives started to canvass the area again, asking if anyone knew of a black male who hung out with Ihab, and sure enough, they got a name, Fat Daddy, aka Robert Taylor, a 16-year-old whose last known address was 15887 Madeline Street, the same street where Matt's body was found. They went there, but they couldn't find him. So on August 20th, they released a photo, here it is, to the media. By August 24th, he turned himself in. The first thing he said, without even being prompted, was, "I did not kill that man," referring to Matt. When he was finally taken into custody for an interrogation, he waived his Miranda rights and told detectives his version of events, starting with the Quiznos situation. Robert said he was just the lookout. He also stated that Matt went with him and Ihab voluntarily, but we know that's not true. Plus, an orange hat was found in Matt's car. When they analyzed it, it had Robert's DNA on it, linking him to being in Matt's car and an accomplice of Ihab's. According to Robert, he and Ihab were looking for a vehicle to steal that day. They rode their bikes to East Point from Detroit and did not want to ride them back because it would take too long. So that's why they wanted to steal a car. Robert Taylor described how he looked out while Ihab forced Matt into the vehicle. Then he showed Matt his gun as they drove away and threatened him. And that's all Robert Taylor would say. He said he's not guilty and stopped speaking. So now detectives go back to the streets, interviewing people in the area where Matt's body was found. They get a big break in the case from a man named Frederick Singleton. He was a crack addict who frequented the area of Madeline and Monarch, and he was able to fill in the gaps about what happened to Matt that Sunday evening. He knew both IHOP and Fat Daddy, Ihab, and Robert Taylor. Fred said it was 10 p.m. and he was outside a crack house in the area when he saw both of the men he knew as Ihab and Fat Daddy. Fat Daddy was driving and Ihab was in the back with Matt. Ihab asked Fred if he had any drugs, and he said no, but "I can get you some." All 3 of them got out of the Honda and went into the drug house. There were 2 women already inside doing drugs. At this point, Ihab gave Fred $100, and he left to go about a block away to get them some crack. He said he was only gone a few minutes. He brought back the drugs, and then Ihab, Fred, and the 2 ladies smoked crack while Robert and Matt sat on the couch. Fred looked over at Matt, who looked really out of place, and he asked him if he wanted some drugs. That's when Ihab interrupted, saying, "Don't worry about him, he's with me." Then Ihab pulled out more crack and Fred, the 2 ladies, and he smoked yet again. Fred told detectives that he left the house around 11 p.m. and he saw 2 guys handing Ihab a gas can. This was all they had to go on, since Robert was done talking and pleaded not guilty to the murder. The trial for both Ihab and Robert was set for September 2010. Meanwhile, remember Christopher Manning, Matt's dad's best friend? Well, months after Matt's death, on April 15th, 2010, Chris, along with some friends, drove back to 14711 Madeline, where Matt's body had been found. They were looking to find a bullet or possibly the gun that killed him. Well, Chris ended up finding a bullet lodged in a wall, so he contacted detectives and they came to retrieve this bullet. Once again, it's Matt's loved ones who are diligently trying to step up to solve this case. The bullet was compared to the firearm found in the Walmart parking lot after that carjacking, but sadly, they were not a match. However, they were about to find out what happened during the trial. Mike Sidori testified for the prosecution. He was an inmate who had been incarcerated with Robert Taylor in maximum security. They came from the same neighborhood, so they connected. Eventually, Robert told Mike the whole story. He said that he and Ihab were hitting licks, which means they were stealing, robbing, or tricking someone out of their vehicle. He told him about beating up Matt and how they all got into the car at Quiznos. In the car, Robert said that Ihab showed Matt a gun and told him what time it was, meaning they were going to kill him. We already know what happened that evening and into the night because we have Fred's story about the crack house. But it's what happened afterward that Mike helped piece together. He said Robert told him that they ultimately took Matt to an abandoned house. Once inside, he punched Matt in the face and then shot him in the back of the head, execution style. Then Robert sold the gun to someone on the streets. Neither Robert nor Ehab showed any remorse or shame during the trial. The two men were found guilty of murder in the first degree, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, carjacking, and a slew of other charges. Matt's mom talked to the media outside the courthouse, and she said that she was relieved with the verdict. However, just 2 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that sentencing minors to a life term without parole was unconstitutional. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling, Robert and Ehab challenged their sentences. Ehab's defense attorney used his painful childhood as a reason to overturn his sentence. It's sad because they ended up having to do a resentencing hearing, and even more heinous details emerged, which Matt's family had to sit through yet again. Thankfully, neither man had been successful in any of their appeals. However, Ehab appealed again after the resentencing hearing, and it wasn't until 2016 that the court ruled against him. But sadly, that's also the year Matt's father passed away at only 64 years old. I read that in 2021, just a year ago, Ehab had tried once again to appeal his conviction, and thankfully the courts denied him again. I like to end on something positive, if possible. Matt Landry's family and friends miss him every day. When his bandmates play together or hold an instrument, they feel his presence. One thing Doreen wanted more than anything was for the homes in that Detroit area to be demolished. She begged the mayor, saying that nothing good came from that place. She pleaded with the mayor to do something about it. In 2010, the mayor started a program to do just that, and the house that Matt was killed in was demolished. I wanted to end with this. Even though Matt was a gifted drummer, his mother, Doreen, told Dateline that he was also a talented acoustic guitarist. He would practice Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven for her in his spare time. She said she would do anything to hear him strum his guitar chords again. She said that they planned to go to the Detroit Symphony before he was taken from her. Doreen and Bob wanted everyone at Matt's funeral to remember his smile and the joy that he brought to them. They wanted Matt to be celebrated for who he was. So the couple approached their priest with a very unusual request during Matt's funeral. Doreen hoped a music group or someone would be willing to perform Stairway to Heaven in the church. The priest promised that he would see what he could do, and acquired a number of talented singers to sing Led Zeppelin's classic in honor of Matt's memory. The song was a fitting choice for a rock star boy who scaled the symbolic staircase well before his time. Halloween is the one night a year when it's completely ordinary to see monsters mingling with the crowd. It's the time for everyone to don costumes and masks, stepping into a world of make-believe. But what if someone truly sinister were lurking behind one of those disguises, using Halloween's shadowy allure to bring a nightmare to life? This is precisely what happened to 21-year-old Nikki Hutchings. Let me introduce you to Nicole Marie Hutchings and her story. Nicole, who was called Nikki by her family and friends, was born in San Francisco, California, on June 15, 1983, to her mom Robin, who met Nicole's stepfather James Hutchings, who went by Jim, when Nicole was only 1. At 2 years old, Jim was the only father that Nikki ever knew, and he considered her his daughter, raising her like she was. So I'm going to refer to Jim as Nikki's father, like she did. Over the coming years, 2 more children joined the Hutchings family. Nikki got a little sister, Amanda, in January of 1987, and her little brother Timothy in July of 1992. After Jim got out of the Marine Corps in 1987, he and Robin decided they wanted to raise their family in a quieter, smaller town, and they fell in love with Bend, Oregon. It had such a peaceful atmosphere, and it was one of the first places that Jim and Robin took Nikki for vacation, where she saw snow for the very first time. It was a very memorable experience. She absolutely loved it. They played in the snow together, built a snowman, and with all the fond memories, the family picked up and moved from California to Bend, which isn't exactly a small town per se, but is said to be either a small city or a big town with a small town feel. It's nestled in the heart of the Cascade Mountains. Bend, Oregon, is a city with a split personality, so to speak. On one hand, it's a laid-back outdoor paradise with world-class skiing, mountain biking, and hiking. But on the other hand, it's a thriving, bustling creative community with a vibrant art scene, a growing craft beer industry, and diverse culinary locations. This duality is reflected in the city's landscape as well. In downtown, you'll find charming brick buildings and tree-lined streets, but if you venture a little further out, you'll find yourself surrounded by towering pines and jagged mountain peaks. So it really is the best of both worlds, and a very nice place to raise kids. In 1987, the town had about 60,000 residents. It was definitely populated back then. Now it's Central Oregon's most populated city. The Hutchings moved to a more rural area. They got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,300 square feet home along the Deschutes River. The river was in their backyard, so they could go fishing right outside, just steps away from their door. That's something that Nikki had been doing since she was only 2 years old. Once in Bend, they enjoyed taking little Nikki to Drake Park, which is gorgeous. It's one of the city's most popular parks. A lot of people from the community frequent the area, surrounded by ponderosa pines, and it's close to a bunch of downtown shops. This park has many events throughout the year, like music events and movies. It's a great place for a little nature walk, and it's actually the place that Nikki gave her grandpa his nickname, Grandpa Duck. The first time he took her there, they saw a bunch of ducks. She could hardly talk at the time, but she managed to say, "Grandpa Duck, Grandpa Duck." It's funny what kind of things stick like that. Drake Park would also remain one of Nikki's favorite places to spend time as she got older. The Hutchings' new home, like I told you, had the perfect view of this river from their kitchen and living room windows. They settled in right before Nikki turned 4, and her little sister Amanda was born. As soon as she became a big sister, Robin said that Nikki was like a little mom. She was so cute. She would sit there and feed her little sister. She even helped her change her diapers and would always ask her mom to take little Amanda out of her crib to play. Nikki also loved learning. Her mom said she actually begged to go to school before she was ready, and she did really well throughout her elementary years. Jim called Nikki a math whiz, but she also loved learning things from her mom, who was a very proud homemaker. She liked to go camping, do craft projects, write poetry, and of course, spend time with her family. Nikki learned to cook and sew. She even helped sew buttons back on Jim's military uniforms. However, she had a daring side as well. Not that you can't if you like doing those things, but Nikki liked being one of the boys, so to speak. She started shooting rifles when she was only 7 years old with her dad, and she also became best buddies with her little brother, who was born 5 years after they settled into Bend, completing the Hutchings family. Another thing Nikki loved to do was actually have silly string fights. She and her friends from school would come over and have full-on silly string shootouts. At first, Jim took a job as a long-haul trucker, but he found it hard to balance his work and personal life. His children were his main priority, and he hated being away from them for so long. Due to the nature of his job, he would spend days, if not weeks, on the road, making it hard for him to be present for all of his children's important memories. Despite his job's financial benefits, Jim ultimately left the trucking industry to spend more time with his family. There was so much to do in Bend, and whether Nikki was by the water or amongst the trees, she seemed to operate on a different level. Being in nature as she grew up put her completely at peace. Those who knew her said she had a magnetic energy when she was outdoors. It was almost like this radiant joy that came over her, and you could almost feel it when you were around her. She absolutely knew she wanted to be around animals as much as she could, and from a young age, she wanted to go into a career that would allow her to do just that. And sometimes you just know at 12 years old, she no longer wanted to shoot deer when she went hunting with Jim. Instead, she would point them out and say, "Daddy, look at that deer," and then they would all get scared away. Jim said, jokingly, that that was the last time she ever went hunting with him. She did begin having some issues at school when she was in the 8th grade. It was a tough time for her. Robin recalls having to race over to the school to find out that Nikki was in trouble yet again. She was a tough girl, and she was very outspoken. If she took issue with something, she would let it be known, and not everyone liked that. This didn't end after middle school. Nikki was known to stick up for herself and was someone you should not mess with. Jim said that he taught all of his kids to defend themselves, and she did. But her outspoken nature actually came from her mama. Nikki attended Mountain View High School, where she met a lot of people. She had a number of very close friends, both guys and girls. She liked to have a lot of fun, but she did have an issue staying out of trouble when she did. I've said it before, she had this tough side to her, and unfortunately it led her to getting into physical fights, and one of them ended up in a suspension. Nikki really needed an outlet, something that she could give her energy to so that she would kind of stay out of trouble. She knew she wanted to go to college and become either a veterinarian or a marine biologist. When she was old enough, she even got a tattoo of a dolphin on her left shoulder because she loved dolphins and wolves. She had a soft spot for both, so she decided to volunteer at the Humane Society of Central Oregon. This led her to find out about an amazing opportunity to work at a wolf sanctuary. Despite all of the demands of high school and her social life, she was determined to pursue her passion, which, if you haven't guessed, was animals. When she was finally old enough, she took a job at that wolf sanctuary to gain more hands-on experience. When she was working, she wasn't just standing around on the sidelines watching. No, she wasn't. Nikki was always getting her hands dirty, cleaning out stalls or handling all the animals. She was up for every challenge, which included possibly going into the Marine Corps. That was something else on her list, just like her dad. So that was another outlet for her. She enrolled in the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps at Mountain View High. She wanted to be more regimented and work on her grades, so she also participated in the Oregon Youth Challenge program. Now, this was sponsored by the Oregon National Guard. It's designed to teach teens work skills and discipline, and it helped Nikki tremendously. So much so that she wanted to give back. During her teen years, in the summers between her sophomore and junior year, and her junior and senior year, Nikki worked with the Youth Conservation Corps. The teens in this program are given schooling and work skill training. They would take on projects to help improve public lands. And Nikki, she was always thinking of others. She even saved enough money that she would buy other people things, and one of the things she bought was for her mom. It was a beautiful silver cross pendant, and it had gold leaves on it. You can tell from everything I've told you that Nikki is compassionate, she's caring, and she loves people. During her senior year, Nikki actually moved on site at the wolf sanctuary. Her everyday routine consisted of living and taking care of these animals, and a bus would transport her to and from school. After Nikki graduated in 2001, she actually decided to continue living and working at the wolf sanctuary. She began working with horses too, and she would do guided tours for people that came to visit. Finally, in the fall of 2001, Nikki wanted a change, sort of. She wanted to come back and live with her family, and of course, she was welcomed with open arms. The thing is, she did have to move into her old room with her little sister Amanda, and there was some sibling rivalry there. She was actually very close with her brother. They were attached at the hip anytime they were together. But Amanda had her own group of friends. She enjoyed kind of doing her own thing. But the sisters did get along very well. They just went through that typical time when there are two teenagers living under the same roof and in one bedroom. So even though they had their normal disagreements, as teens usually do, they loved each other and liked spending time together with their family. When Nikki moved back in, she quickly got a job, and actually a number of them over the next few years. This is not too uncommon for a teen. She would start working somewhere, get a few paychecks, get a little money, and then quit. She just didn't know exactly what she wanted to do yet. But one thing was certain. Nikki always knew how to make friends. Her mom remembers her bringing a new friend home every week, and she would have no idea where she met this person. But many times, Nikki would also move out and live with those friends here and there, but then she would come back to live with her family. And even when she wasn't living under their roof, she wouldn't go more than a couple of days without seeing them. They thought it was always nice having Nikki around, and they were so happy when she came back to live with them again. In September of 2004, the holidays were right around the corner, and the Hutchings family always looked forward to spending time together. I told you that this was a Halloween-related case. Well, the kids in Bend, Oregon, like many other children across the United States, liked to get dressed up for Halloween and go trick-or-treating. Almost every house was decorated and waiting for kids to come knocking. But as the Hutchings kids got older, they grew out of trick-or-treating and would rather spend time at parties or doing other festive activities. By 2004, the Hutchings family had relocated to a similar 3-bedroom, 2-bath home about 15 minutes away from where they previously were living. Now this area is much more populated. You can see lots of houses. It's a suburban area. Their home was on the end of a cul-de-sac with breathtaking mountain views in the Wishing Well subdivision. It was Halloween night on Sunday, October 31st in 2004. Nikki was 21, Amanda was 17, and Tim was 13. That morning, Amanda got ready for work for her job at a local department store nearby. She was expecting to get done somewhere around 7:45 p.m. Amanda did not drive yet, and she relied on either her parents or her older sister Nikki to pick her up and drop her off when she needed to go anywhere. So even though Amanda's workplace was within walking distance from their home, she did not like walking home alone in the dark at night, especially on Halloween night. So she asked Nikki if she could come get her later, but Nikki had plans of her own. She wanted to stay home and hand out candy. So she said, "You know what? Dad will be out of work by then. He'll probably opt to just swing by and pick you up." Jim did everything for his family, especially his kids, and he was more than happy to go get Amanda that night. He didn't want her to walk home all by herself. He called being a dad his #1 job, even though his actual job was a local bus driver. Nikki wanted to be home at night for those trick-or-treaters. Before Amanda left, Nicole turned to her in a serious tone and asked her if she could talk to her about something important when she got home. It seemed like Nikki had something on her mind, so Amanda agreed that she would, and then she left. The day started out perfectly normal. Robin and Nikki got the candy ready for the kids, and Jim went off to work. Later that evening, when he came home, the family had fun handing out some candy for a bit until Jim had to leave to go get Amanda and run a few errands. There had been many knocks on that door that night, one after the other, but there was one right before 1 p.m. that was different. It was too late to be trick-or-treaters, and Robin was taking care of the household chores, so Nikki went to see who it was. It wouldn't have been her dad and sister, who they were expecting home any minute because they wouldn't need to knock. So she had no idea who would be at their doorstep that night. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see a couple of her close friends standing outside. They were on their way to a nearby Halloween party at a mutual friend's house and wanted to know if Nikki was interested in coming along. So Nikki, being 21, definitely liked to hang out, party, and have a few drinks, especially on a festive night like Halloween. So she said yes. She told her friends she would be right back, and she quickly went inside to let her mom know that she'd be going to a friend's Halloween party. Robin didn't even think twice about it. It was completely typical of Nikki. She was very independent, but responsible enough to at least let her parents know where she was going and check in. Robin just told Nikki to be safe and have fun. She had no idea that would be the last time she saw her daughter. The last goodbye, the last time she would see her smile as she was excited to have some fun that night. It was her very last Halloween with Nikki, one that would be undoubtedly etched into her memory forever. When Nikki got to the Halloween party, it was filled with a bunch of her friends, as well as people that she didn't know. Some were in full-on costumes, so you couldn't even make out who they were, while other people came dressed in normal, everyday clothing. That is how Nikki went, because it was a choice that she made at the very last minute. But there was dancing, of course, loud music, drinking, all while being surrounded by Halloween decorations. This party extended past midnight into the early morning hours of November 1st. As everyone fell back into their post-spooky season normality, the Hutchings household was getting up for a typical Monday morning. That's when Jim noticed that Nikki wasn't around, so he checked her room, and she wasn't there. He had no idea that she had gone out the night before. The last time he saw her, she was in her room filling out job applications. By the time he came home with Amanda, he had no idea she had already left. But when he couldn't find her that morning, Robin let him know that she attended a Halloween party at a friend's house the night before. When he heard this, Jim was like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. She was probably drinking, and she decided to sleep over at a friend's house." He figured she would call and check in or show back up at the house by the afternoon. Maybe she slept in after a long night. I mean, she hadn't even left until a little after 10 p.m. Typically, the morning after a Halloween party, or any party, isn't nearly as fun and glamorous as the night before, when you're all dressed up in your costume or your cute outfit, and you've had a few drinks. You feel emboldened to do things you wouldn't normally do if your face was showing without the mask or you were sober. And that following morning always comes with a healthy dose of reality. Groggy partygoers wake up with busting hangovers and their faces still caked with last night's makeup. When the dark cloud of Halloween is lifted and the costumes are tucked away and the makeup is washed off, everyone goes back to their typical lives in the real world. But Nikki still wasn't home by late afternoon, and she hadn't called her family, so they started to question why. It wasn't like her to be that out of touch. Jim and Robin also noticed that Nikki had left the night before without her purse or her ID. Both were still in her bedroom. Now granted, this was a house party with friends. She wouldn't have had to show proof that she was 21 years old and she got a ride. But it also signaled to them that Nikki intended to come home in a reasonable amount of time, since at some point she would need her belongings. It's true, if someone has a purse or wallet that they use all the time, they're probably not going to even leave that behind at all. And if they do, it's because they figure they'll be right back. So now Nikki's family is growing concerned. They still weren't that worried, but they did begin calling a number of Nikki's friends, and there were a lot to get in touch with. They were hoping that at least one of them was with her or knew where she was. This went on into the evening, and the family had called everyone who was close to Nikki and then began calling her acquaintances, people she babysat for. They just wanted to exhaust all avenues before taking the dreaded next step of calling the police. But no one knew where Nikki was, and now there was a reason to be concerned. They knew if Nikki was just with friends, she would have let them know, especially if she wasn't coming back home. This is when the Hutchings started to have a very bad feeling, and they reached out to Bend Police Department. Something I didn't know before researching this case is that there is actually a spike in crimes during certain holidays in America, and Halloween is one of them. I figured New Year's, but that's more drunk driving deaths. However, Independence Day and Halloween rank high as times of the year when violent crime, in particular, tends to go up. Now I do holiday homicides, and now I know why I stumble upon such heartbreaking stories at times when people are usually looking forward to the holiday cheer. The types of crimes that typically go up on July 4th and Halloween are burglaries, carjackings, vandalism, and alcohol-related crimes like underage drinking. At Christmas and New Year's, sadly, there's a spike in more domestic crimes, and that's sad and shocking. The police in Bend, Oregon, actually dread going on patrol during Halloween night. It's one of the worst nights of the year for them. It's as though the darkness of the night dedicated to evil provides a veil for real-life monsters to lurk in those shadows. The police are not used to getting calls for adults going missing, and when they do, you probably know what they assume, that these people want to disappear, that they've left on their own free will. But they still take these reports seriously. Sometimes they just approach them a little differently. But there were some red flags right away in this case. For one, Nikki left her ID and purse behind, as we know. Then she got a ride from someone, and no one knew where she was or who that was. There were a lot of unknowns. What the Bend police did know was that Nikki was 21 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 160 pounds, and had brown hair and blue eyes. The other unique identifiers were that she had a slight gap between her two front teeth, a pierced tongue with a silver barbell, and tattoos of a rose and a dolphin on the back of her left shoulder. She was last seen wearing a maroon polo shirt with the words City of Bend on it and black windbreaker-style pants with white tennis shoes. The Bend Police Department sent Detective Brian Candell out to meet the Hutchings and take a detailed report. He talked to Robin, Amanda, and Jim, and they told him everything we already know. But there were a couple of things that I haven't gone into detail about. First, Amanda kept stressing that her sister wouldn't leave like this. Then she mentioned something that stood out, the fact that right before leaving for work, Nikki stopped her and told her she had something important to talk to her about. Then she recalled Nikki just telling her, "I love you, and I'll see you later." But she never did see her later, so she can't help but wonder what Nikki wanted to confide in her about. That bothered Amanda. She felt like it might have something to do with why she's gone. That would be very haunting, not knowing what Nikki was hiding or wanted to get off her chest. The other new piece of evidence is that Nikki had a boyfriend named Bobby. She'd been seeing him for a while, and at first Jim and Robin liked him. He seemed really nice and got along with the whole family. Things seemed to work out really nicely between him and Nikki. But as time went on, the Hutchings felt like they were seeing more of Bobby's true colors, and they did not like the way he treated Nikki. He seemed to take advantage of her, and they had reason to believe that things could have gotten physical between them. So now, since Nikki's missing, they're questioning whether Bobby could be responsible. By the next day, Nikki still had not shown up. This was November 2nd, and there really wasn't much to go on. But Detective Kendall wanted to track Bobby down to see if he had any additional information for them. He also wanted to find out if any of Nikki's friends could provide more information about the location of the Halloween party, as well as the host and everyone that was in attendance that night. They would need to question everyone. Meanwhile, the Hutchings were now in a panic. A whole day had gone by, 24 hours, with no word from Nikki. It was hard to go about normal activities when a huge piece of your life is missing. All they could do was wait, and Jim felt like the worst part was not knowing where Nikki was. Detectives tracked Bobby down and asked him if he knew where Nikki was. He essentially told them it was not his job to keep tabs on his ex-girlfriend, and that piqued their interest. Ex-girlfriend? Since when, they wondered? He let them know right away that he and Nikki broke up over that past weekend, just a couple of days before she attended that Halloween party and was not seen again. That raised a red flag. Had the breakup turned into something more sinister or even deadly? In order to rule Bobby out, the detectives told him they would like to have a formal interview with him, and they would like him to take a polygraph. I know they're not reliable enough to be used as evidence in court, but they can be used as a tool to detect deception, and that could be a big clue for them. Bobby was asked questions related to whether he had anything to do with Nikki's disappearance, and it turned out there was no deception detected in his responses. He also had an alibi for Halloween night, and it was able to be confirmed. Now, this doesn't mean that they just checked him off their list as a potential suspect. It just means, for the time being, they can continue looking in other directions that might bring in more viable leads. But they didn't have any, and days just kept passing, and Nikki's family was not doing well. Amanda was having a very hard time dealing with the emptiness that she felt. She said it left a hole that was just empty space in her life, and she described it as horrifying. The family, and even the police, began monitoring her credit cards and bank statements, but there was no recent activity. The local daily newspaper and media outlet, called the Bend Bulletin, began posting about Nikki's disappearance, and the Bend Police Department put out their own news release asking anyone with information to please contact Detective Brian Kell. They were still in the process of tracking down all of those partygoers from Halloween night. And finally, one woman that they were interviewing, named Mary, said that not only was she a friend of Nikki, but she was at the party, and it was thrown at the house she lived in. So of course they wanted to know details. Mary explained she lived with two roommates. Both of them were men. Lauren Bowers and the other was Craig Whiting. They threw a big Halloween party that night. They invited a bunch of their friends, including Nikki, who was very good friends with both of them. Now, Lauren had a girlfriend who had two kids. One was 6 and the other was 4, and Nikki would come over to babysit them all the time, and that's how she met Mary. As far as the party was concerned, Mary said that there was nothing out of the ordinary, but she wasn't able to give a full account of everyone in attendance because there were a lot of people coming and going that night. Some even brought their own friends. But at least they had 2 names of people they could reach out to. They wasted no time. They got the address, and detectives went over to Lauren and Craig's to see if they could provide them with any new leads. When they arrived, the house was packed with a bunch of friends. The roommates were just hanging out. They asked to speak to 34-year-old Lauren and 23-year-old Craig separately. Both of them said the same thing. They explained they had known Nikki for a long time. Craig told them that he was a very close friend with her and her family. He even lived with them for quite some time when he was trying to find a place of his own. Lauren explained that he had been best friends with Craig, and they lived together with Mary at the house where the Halloween party was held, the one that the officers were standing in front of at that moment. They explained that they planned this party earlier that month, and Craig added that he was actually the one who came to Nikki's house that night. He thought Nikki could use a night out, and he was in the area, so he stopped by to ask her if she wanted to come over. Maybe he knew about the breakup, and you know how that goes sometimes. When you're finally single, you get to hang out more. Everyone living in Lauren's house was interviewed, but none of them knew where Nikki might be. They said the party was packed, and the last time they thought they saw her was probably around midnight. They were all drinking, and many partygoers were heavily intoxicated that night. Nikki's friends were genuinely worried about her. They weren't overly concerned at this point. They were just all hoping that she would turn back up. But no one had heard from her or seen her since that night. If they did provide anything, it was more of their own opinions instead of facts, like giving possibilities of where Nikki might be. Maybe she left with someone, or did you talk to her boyfriend? Things like that. However, the detectives were able to get more names of friends who were there that night, and when asked if they remembered seeing Nikki, many said they didn't. If anyone said they did, it was maybe for a few minutes. It was kind of like she was invisible that night. No one really recalled when she left or even seeing her leave. They don't remember anything that stood out to them. For example, if she had been the last to leave the party with a whole bunch of other people, maybe somebody would remember that. Like we closed it down. There were no significant interactions that took place to put a time on when they recalled seeing her last, if at all. It is tough. You don't go into a party or anywhere saying, I better remember everything I saw because I'm going to be questioned about this later. It's hard to rack your brain after the fact. Now, detectives wonder if Nikki wandered out of this house on her own that night. Did she get intoxicated and walk off? Did she get kidnapped? Was there a stranger in this house with bad intentions? But they weren't much further in this investigation. When Nikki's family was asked about Lauren and Craig, it was kind of a dead end. They echoed the same things that the guys had told the detectives. Jim confirmed that Craig is a close friend of Nikki's. Everyone loved him. They called him Baby Huey because he was a big goofy guy and a good guy. So this helped detectives move along and expand the search outward to other states. Now Nikki's picture, all her information, and details surrounding her disappearance were shared across agencies all over the country. Since they didn't have any new leads, they decided to run some background checks on everyone living at the house that hosted the party, as well as people that were in attendance. They had to start somewhere, and there weren't that many things that stood out. If anyone had a record, there were no violent crimes. Craig didn't have any offenses, but there was one thing that looked questionable in regard to Nikki's good friend, Lauren Bowers. It's something that stunned everyone close to him, especially Nikki's family. It turned out that Lauren was a registered sex offender. I think you know what that means, and it's not good. No one knew. Nikki's dad remembers getting that news and being floored. He could not imagine that at all. The charge, in case you're wondering, was from a decade before this, and it was for intercourse with someone underage. This man was 24 at the time. So of course, Dr. Kandel goes back to confront Lauren about his past, and he's very open about it. He explains that it was a mistake. It's something from my past. It happened a long time ago, and he's moved forward. It had been, I think, a decade by then, and he wants to keep it in the past. He told them that he would do whatever they needed in order to cooperate in Nikki's case. This is pretty disturbing, and it makes me wonder if anyone close to him knew about this. I mean, he was registered, but as it related to Nikki's case at hand, There was no connection or evidence that Lauren or anyone else they interviewed knew anything. Plus, at this point, it's still a missing persons case. They didn't have any real evidence to connect to anyone. They were still in the information gathering phase. Now, Nikki's family organized a local search effort in Bend. They distributed flyers with her picture and a description, and several members of her family spoke to local media, asking anyone with information to contact law enforcement. That's when people started to come forward. They were telling police that they had seen Nikki, and this made her family so hopeful. But the problem was, none of these eyewitness accounts could be confirmed. As a bus driver, Jim found himself driving by Drake Park every time he was working, just keeping his eyes out for anyone that looked like his daughter. The whole family was having a hard time believing that this was their new reality, but they were really trying to hold on to hope that Nikki would be found and found alive. Every time they saw someone that resembled her, they stopped and took a closer look, and every time a knock came to the door, they thought it could be Nikki, but it wasn't. Then, things took a darker turn. There were 3 separate tipsters who came forward and told the police to look into a guy known as Spider. The reason why was pretty terrifying. Apparently, this man had admitted to killing Nikki and burying her body on his property. Yet, that would definitely be a reason to look into him, so they made the Spider person their main priority. After digging deeper, they found out his real name is Danny Shane. He's also a convicted felon and is associated with a local and violent gang known as the Park Rats. The name might be kind of silly, but their actions were nothing to laugh about. They had been committing offenses on people in the downtown Bend area, targeting Drake Park specifically. That's where the name came from, Park Rats. But that's also a location that Nikki frequented. It was not the safest place at night. During the day, beautiful, but at night it was being overrun by homeless encampments. There were alcohol-related offenses going on, and natural risks as well, like wild animals coming out and roaming the area. So many locals knew better than to go there at night. This particular gang had been known to be involved in drug dealing, and Spider specifically had a bad reputation for harassing people. He was also the so-called gang leader, so they apprehended him and brought him in for questioning. When the name Spider was mentioned to Nikki's family, the detectives were surprised that they were actually familiar with Danny. They did not know him personally, but Jim and Amanda had both heard the name before because Nikki went to high school with Danny, or Spider, and he had changed a lot since then. Jim definitely made it clear he was not a fan. So the detectives asked Spider how he knew Nikki, and he said high school. They asked when the last time he talked to her was, and he said he thought it was a few weeks ago. Well, that lines up with when she went missing. So they asked whether there was an issue between the two of them, and he looked at them genuinely confused and said no. That's when they let him know that Nikki was missing. So, you know what he tells them? He tells them that she probably wanted to go somewhere if she was gone. That's not the best answer. So, they go one step further and give him a polygraph, which Danny agrees to, and he passes with no deception. But it was so hard not to think that he knew more than he was letting on. I mean, those are pretty harsh allegations, that he's going around telling people he killed Nikki and she was buried on his property. After letting him go, the Bend Police Department sent out helicopters to fly over Danny's house and the land that he lived on. They were looking for disturbed ground where a grave could have been dug, but they were not able to locate anything. It's been a few weeks now, and they were scanning for a grave, which meant there was a possibility that they believed Nikki could be dead. Her family had already been preparing themselves to get that kind of news, because weeks turned into months, and still nothing. The chances of her being alive didn't seem high. Something I wanted to mention is that Nikki's little brother, Tim, was only 13, and he had a very hard time understanding that someone could just be gone. It's not something that parents think about explaining to their children. They don't ever think they're going to have to explain that their sibling just vanishes. It's not something we usually teach our children about because we don't ever want that to be the case in our own family. Jim said that Tim worshipped the ground that Nikki walked on. He was completely lost without his big sister, and the whole family felt disconnected. They all had a new purpose, and that was finding Nikki. It consumed them day in and day out. Amanda didn't even know who she was without being a younger sister to Nikki. Her whole identity was in crisis. It was like they could not move forward without answers. It wasn't long after this that the Hutchings were contacted by the Portland, Oregon Police Department. It's not a call that any family wants to receive. They were told that a body had been found and it matched Nikki's description. So they wanted someone from the family to make an identification. It wasn't long after this that the Hutchings were contacted by the Portland, Oregon Police Department. It's not a call that any family wants to receive. They were told that a body had been found, and it matched Nikki's description. So they wanted someone from the family to make an identification. Everyone was in shock, but Jim decided to ask one question. Did the victim have a tattoo of a dolphin on her left shoulder? As they waited to hear back, I'm sure it was agonizing. When the officer called Jim and informed him that there was not a tattoo located on this person, as harsh as it sounds, they were relieved that it wasn't Nikki. But it was heartbreaking that somewhere out there was a family that lost someone. Sadly, now the Hutchings knew what it was like to get a phone call like that, and they were hoping they wouldn't have to experience the reality of it. But we know the story doesn't end well. Finally, there seemed to be some surprisingly good news. Detectives had continued to track Nikki's credit card, her bank account, and cell phone, and after a few months, their persistence eventually paid off. The detectives received a hit on one of Nicole's credit cards, and they were excited. This was an indication that Nikki was still out there. They just needed to track down where these purchases were made. They didn't waste any time. They immediately reached out to the Hutchings, and Robin answered. They let her know the news about all hope was dashed when Robin admitted that it was actually her that used that account. It was not Nikki. That would be tough because you're expecting to hear some good news, and then it's not. It's nothing. It's another dead end. After so many months went by, the calls from detectives came in less and less because the case was growing colder and colder. Life was standing still for the Hutchings. Amanda was a senior in high school, and she was so excited about applying to colleges earlier that year and eagerly awaiting her acceptance letters. But now, none of that seemed important. Eventually, she did learn that she had not only been accepted to a university in Minnesota, but she got a full scholarship, and she was overjoyed to hear this news. But at the same time, she could not leave her family. Not at a time like this. The question about what happened to Nikki would linger for close to 3 long years. As it turned out, there was someone hiding something. They knew what happened. It took them that long to build up the courage to come forward and reveal that secret. In March of 2007, a woman that I'm going to call Jenny came into the Bend police station wanting to speak with an officer. She's an old friend of Nikki's, and she wants to come forward with information about her disappearance now. For some background, they find out they had already interviewed Jenny back when they were questioning everyone who attended the Halloween party. She was there. She was the girlfriend of Lauren Bowers, the one with the 6-year-old and the 4-year-old child at the time. She's the mother of one of Lauren's children, the younger one, but they had a pretty rocky relationship and had since broken up. That is what prompted her to speak up, and what she says astonishes the detectives. They asked her what happened, and Jenny said that Lauren killed Nikki. They wanted to know how she knew that, and Jenny admitted that Lauren told her he was going to kill Nikki that night. Later, she saw her show up at that house, and she knew it wasn't going to be good. That is a lot to keep inside. She goes on to explain that she remembers a couple of days after Lauren told her that he was going to kill Nikki, and then she showed up at the Halloween party. That's when police came to their door and told them she was missing. Jenny was questioned, but at the time, she lied. She said it had been a few weeks since she saw Nikki last, but that wasn't true. She told them she lied because she was scared. She says that Lauren actually threatened her, saying if she ever told anyone, he would shoot her in the head, right between the eyes, actually. This wasn't the first time he told her not to talk, so she kept quiet. But this was merely words. It was a story. There was no solid proof at this point. There wasn't even a body. So the detectives devised a plan. They asked Jenny if she thought that Lauren would talk to her about the whole situation, and she said she thought he would. So this woman bravely agreed to wear a wire and meet with Lauren while the cops were standing by with rifles, listening in to make sure that Jenny wasn't in any danger. She arranged to meet Lauren at a park to talk, and the plan seemed to work. Lauren met with Jenny, and she told him she wanted to know everything that happened to Nikki. Lauren asked Jenny if he could trust her. When she said yes, he revealed that Nikki was trying to destroy Lauren's life with Jenny. He didn't know what else he was supposed to do, and he would rather be dead than go back to jail. He actually said he would rather take his own life than go back to jail. But detectives had no idea what Lauren was referring to. But instead, Lauren started to become agitated with Jenny, asking more and more probing questions. He wanted to know why all of a sudden she wanted to know about all this. He said, "How come before you didn't want to talk to me about none of this, and all of a sudden now you want to talk?" "Because it's been bugging me," she replied. He got suspicious and point-blank asked Jenny if she told the cops he had done something. Then he asked her if she was wearing a wire. Jenny of course said no, saying, "You actually believe that I would wear an effing wire?" I guess that was convincing, but Lauren ironically explained that Jenny had no idea how good the technology was. They could tap anything. This was 2007, so imagine how far it's come now. He said, "Why are you asking me these questions? Did you tell the cops I did something? You actually believe I would wear a wire? You don't understand the technology they have now. They can tap anything." But this was not going well for Jenny. However, somehow she knew how to calm him down enough for him to admit that, in his words, he had gotten rid of her. Okay, that was enough to arrest Lauren Bowers. It was at the very least an admission that he knew what happened to Nikki, and that he had something to do with it, even if he wasn't the person that actually did it. They apprehended him a few days later, on March 12th, not to tip off that Jenny helped them. More in-depth background checks revealed that Lauren was a twice-convicted sex offender who was sentenced to nearly 2 years in 1995 for first- and third-degree forcible intercourse. Go look it up. It's not good. The victims were 13 to 16 years old. After his release from prison in 1997, he dropped out of the offender program altogether and stopped reporting to his probation officer for quite some time. He had also been convicted of being a felon in possession of a firearm, theft, and giving false information to police. So they were thinking they probably wouldn't get someone that would cooperate with them in this investigation. But they were wrong, because as soon as Lauren sat down, he was in tears. He was begging them to believe that he had nothing to do with this. He was saying someone else was involved, and that person was probably going to try to pin everything on Lauren. So who's this other person? Well, according to Lauren, it was none other than his very best friend, Craig Whiting. You know, the guy who came to pick Nikki up the night of the party? The close friend of hers who knew her family for years, who Jim called the big goofy good guy. Why would you have a reason to hurt Nikki? These people were all close. Well, Detective Kendall, who had already spoken to Craig back when he did his initial investigation, called him back in for a follow-up interview and got right to the point. He said, "Listen, we know what happened, and you're close friends with this family. They took you in when you had nothing. It's time for you to do the right thing and admit what you have done to their daughter." You could physically see Craig take a deep breath, and detectives thought, okay, he is going to spill. They asked him who was the mastermind behind Nikki's disappearance, and he said the mastermind was Lauren. So how was Craig involved? Well, according to him, Lauren asked Craig to help him get rid of Nikki. When Detective Kendall asked, "What does that mean to you? Get rid of or take care of her?" Craig just said, "Probably killing her." He was so nonchalant. But why though? Craig said that it all started when Nikki, in his words, began spreading rumors about Lauren that he had touched one of the children inappropriately, really that Nikki babysat for. And if that got out, it's something that could put Lauren back in jail. Nikki babysat for a few of the people who lived at Lauren's, and one of the mother's young children came to her and told her that Lauren did something inappropriate and took pictures of her without clothes. Well, this was serious. Nikki was also in fear for the children due to drug-related activities that she witnessed going on at that house. So this was it. Nikki brought this information to the mother of that child, and the mother confronted Lauren about it. Now, I don't know who this child was, whether this was one of Jenny's children, the one that's not biologically Lauren's, because this was a 6-year-old, and we know that Jenny had a 6-year-old at the time. If you recall on The Wire, Lauren explicitly said that Nikki was trying to ruin his life with Jenny. That could merely mean that he knew if he went to jail, they would no longer be a couple, or it could be something more. Whoever it was whose child was involved, when their mother confronted Lauren, he went into a rage. He was punching walls and asked them, "Who told you this?" When they admitted it was Nikki, he told them he would kill Nikki. So this does sound like what Jenny admitted to. Then he went on to say something so disgusting and chilling. He said that he had holes in the ground around Smith Rock and Sun River that could swallow Nikki up. It turned out that when detectives looked into these allegations, they were not rumors. Nikki had gone one step further and filed an actual complaint with the Oregon Department of Human Services, alleging that Lauren was inappropriate with the child and exposed them to a drug-filled environment. But how does Craig fit into all of this? Remember, he doesn't even have a criminal record. When they were waiting for him to hopefully confess everything that happened, they stumbled upon a very frightening detail about Craig's past, one that makes them question whether he could be capable of hurting anyone, especially a woman. Back when Craig was only 11 years old, he and his mother, Margaret, who went by Peggy and was 38 at the time, were living with Peggy's boyfriend, 40-year-old John Ma, in his double-wide mobile home in Anchorage, Alaska. Peggy went missing between April 25th and 27th of 1992. When she didn't show up at work, her sister, Suzanne, was alerted. She ended up calling Peggy's boyfriend, who told her that Peggy had gone on a drunken vacation in Seattle. He claimed he had been receiving calls from her, saying she would return on May 28th. But when she didn't show up, her co-workers filed a missing persons report. She had been gone for 5 weeks at this point. On May 30th, Peggy's sister flew out to Anchorage and showed up unannounced at the mobile home where her nephew, Craig, was living with John. When John opened the door, he apologized immediately for the terrible smell and said that Peggy's dogs, his words, had pottied inside the house. At this point, Suzanne hadn't even noticed the smell at all, but the whole situation seemed very suspicious. So, she took 11-year-old Craig with her and left. A few days later, Suzanne went back to the mobile home to get some of her nephew's things, and that's when she noticed the entire place had been cleaned from top to bottom. It reeked of pine. Again, John said, "I'm sorry, I was just trying to get rid of the doggy smell." Meanwhile, the Anchorage Police Department learned that John was on parole for burglary, robbery, and theft. After interviewing several people, there were so many inconsistencies in his story. Not only that, but friends of Peggy came forward, saying that she had told them she and John had been fighting in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One time, he even tried to choke her. Without going into too much detail to derail from Nikki's case, I'll tell you what you can probably guess. Craig's mom, Peggy, she was dead. And poor Craig had been living among his mother's corpse this entire time. John had crammed her into the crawl space underneath the double-wide trailer and then lied to Craig, saying that his mother ran off and left him. Can you imagine, at 11 years old, feeling like your mom did that to you? All the while, John was going down there and pouring bottle after bottle of pine over Peggy's remains to hide the smell of decomposition. Once John knew that they found Peggy, he told the police he killed her, but it was all in self-defense. Isn't it always? His story was that on the night of the killing, Peggy came home drunk and attacked him in his sleep. She was yelling at him and berating him for not going to a bar with her. John said he had to fight back, so he grabbed whatever was nearby, and that was a large, heavy metal ashtray. He took it and swung it at Peggy, smashing her head in. But to his surprise, she continued to yell and struggle. So, he stuffed socks in her mouth to silence her. As the situation escalated, he tied her arms and hands with rope, and then he tied the rope around her neck, ultimately choking her to death. Then he wrapped her body in plastic and lowered her into that crawl space beneath the double-wide trailer. That is so disgusting, and poor Craig, we will never know what he witnessed. If he was home that night, he surely must have heard something behind those thin walls. So after John's confession, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, and there was little Craig in the courtroom, holding a box containing his mother's ashes. Knowing that Craig's own mother had been murdered, would he ever condone an act like this? Did he really have anything to do with this, or was his older best buddy trying to pin it all on him? Well, back in the interview room, Detective Candell asked Craig, "Did Nikki do anything to you to upset you?" And he said no, she hadn't. What he admitted to next blows my mind. He said that he figured since Lauren was his best friend, he should be able to do anything for his best friend, even murder. Yeah, Craig admitted he looked to Lauren as his older brother, and if a brother asks you to do something, you help them out. If you can do it, you do it. And when bluntly asked, even commit murder? Craig said yes. But had he, or was he just covering for Lauren? They needed more to go on, but wow, the lengths that some people will go for loyalty. Detective Candell said this was deeply disturbing to him. It would be for most of us who are human beings. To get a confession from Lauren, they told him that they had him on tape admitting that he had gotten rid of Nikki. He refused to admit that he said that, but we know he did because we heard it, and they were there and saw his demeanor change. That's when they told him, "We talked to Craig, and it's time to allow Nikki's parents to bury their daughter." But it would take 2 whole days so they could piece together exactly what happened. They got it out of them with the most important piece of evidence, where Nikki was. To avoid being sentenced to death, Craig agreed to show Detective Vincent and Candell where they buried Nikki's body. The detectives made note that Craig's remorse, well, there was none. It was like he accidentally ran over a cat. But what they meant was that it seemed like this wasn't a big deal to him. He didn't have an ounce of compassion. How can people like this exist? I don't know, but meanwhile, Lauren was still making confessions about exactly what happened. I will tell you everything after I explain where Craig instructed the detectives to look. It was a very remote area, about 20 miles out, in the middle of a forest off a fire road. This area is southeast of the town of Sun River. Remember, Jenny said that Lauren told her he had holes in Sun River that would swallow Nikki up. This is probably only about 35 to 40 minutes away from where they had that Halloween party. But the detectives admitted they would have never looked here. More than a dozen officers, crime scene technicians, and search personnel went out there to assist, and a cadaver dog was brought out to sniff for human remains. Craig led them to an area in the middle of the trees, where he said he and Lauren made sure to put a partially burned log over the site where Nikki was. But this had been almost 3 years, and there was a lot out there. But there's a lot of logs out there, and they didn't know exactly where the location was. But it didn't take them long to narrow it down, and they began digging using shovels and buckets in a 4x6 area. Here are some pictures of this excavation on the screen. Finally that evening, in a shallow grave, officers found probable human remains that they believed belonged to Nicole Hutchings. Now was the time to hear the whole story and to charge both Lauren Bowers and Craig Whiting with the murder of Nicole Hutchings. Putting together both confessions, detectives were able to ascertain that Lauren wanted to silence Nikki. She was doing all she could to defend this innocent child and keep them safe, only to be met with a monster who'd rather have her destroyed than face the consequences of his own disgusting actions. So, back in early October 2004, Lauren devised a plan with his bestie Craig to get rid of Nikki. They needed a way to get her alone though, so they thought of something simple, something innocuous, and they came up with throwing a big Halloween party and inviting the entire neighborhood, all of their friends, including Nikki. But the night before this big bash, they went out to that remote location and dug a 3-foot grave, a shallow 3-foot grave, knowing that they planned to kill Nikki the very next night to put her inside there. Then, on the night of October 31st, Craig was the one who went over there and convinced Nikki to come have some fun. Lauren did his best to stay kind of out of sight that night, and he let Craig handle serving Nikki drink after drink of what they called jungle punch. But Nikki's was spiked with Vicodin, and it didn't take long for poor Nikki to be barely coherent. She was unable to walk without assistance and was totally out of it. And that's when they got her into Lauren's truck, and Craig told the investigators he was hammered. He drove Lauren and an incapacitated Nikki out to the makeshift gravesite. Once they were there, Craig agreed to make it quick. He wanted to get it over with. Quickly, they dragged her out of the vehicle to where the grave was dug. Then Craig took what's called a tire buddy. This is a heavy metal-tipped instrument, like a club. It's used to check tire pressure on vehicles. I'm showing one on the screen. It kinda looks like a bat or a wooden stick. It's 16 inches long, and he took it and swung it at the back of Nikki's head at full force. He thought he could kill her in one strike, but when she was knocked down, she proceeded to get back up. She was not dead. That's when Lauren grabbed this club-like item, taking it right out of Craig's hands, and began pounding Nikki again and again until she was unconscious. But before Nikki stopped breathing, the men stripped her down and dumped her into the hole in the ground. Then they covered her with dirt. This woman was buried alive. She suffocated to death, all alone out in those dark woods, after two of her closest friends tricked her on a night reserved for tricks of a more innocent kind. By Tuesday afternoon on March 13th, both men were arrested and charged with 1 count each of aggravated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping. They were held without bail due to the aggravated circumstances related to the deliberate cruelty involved in this case, and that a weapon was used on a vulnerable victim. The aggravated murder count alleges that these men were trying to cover up the crimes of child neglect and criminal mistreatment by killing Nikki. Lauren was also charged in relation to that young child. Excavation of the site was continuing on Tuesday evening, and the remains were sent to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office for confirmation of identification. They said it would be weeks before authorities would know if the remains were 100% confirmed to be Nikki's. The cause of death was still under investigation. They also obtained a search warrant for a Dodge Travelcraft motorhome that was near Lone Cow Drive, which I'm showing here. This is where Lauren was apparently living at the time of his arrest, and it was believed that this was the vehicle Nikki was transported in, and that the instrument used to try to kill her was still inside. Police seized evidence, putting it into brown paper bags, and then they impounded that vehicle for processing at the crime lab. That night, around 9:45, detectives showed up at the Hutchings front door. Jim knew when he saw them that this was something bad. Amanda looked right at the detectives and said, "Please don't tell me that my sister's dead." They looked at her, just shaking their heads back and forth, and she knew. Right then, she collapsed onto the floor. But once everyone was able to gain their composure, the detectives had more bad news. They revealed who was responsible for Nikki's murder, and when her family found out who had done this, they were shocked. Craig, Goofy Craig, who was cared for in their own home. How? And Lauren, Nikki's best friend? Why? Jim said he wished they would both rot in hell. The family was then led into the coroner's office at this time, and Jim will never forget seeing Nikki's dolphin tattoo and knowing that this time it was really her. It was unbelievable. It was the worst news a family could have gotten, but at least she was found, and Jim said she is home. But he also said he would like to save taxpayers' money and take care of these monsters himself. That is how angry he was towards both of them, because how could they do such a thing? Amanda said her sister died a hero. She was killed for protecting a child, for doing the right thing, and it reminded me so much of Allie Lamont. I talked about her case in the beginning of this month, another very sad story. They did not deserve this. A memorial service was held for Nikki on Friday, March 23rd, and her family and friends gathered around to say their goodbyes and to share memories of Nikki. It would be nearly another year until both Lauren and Craig pleaded guilty to Nikki's murder. Lauren would plead guilty in December of 2007, but he did say he never did anything to that child. He said in court, "I want to apologize to give my deepest regrets for the pain and suffering I caused Nicole and her family. I deserve the punishment that has been given." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then Craig finally pleaded guilty in February of 2008, and the circuit court judge, Alta Brady, was presiding over his sentencing trial. They were trying to actually decide if he would spend the rest of his life in prison or someday have a chance to get out. I'm thinking, life for sure, but his lawyer brought up the fact that Craig's own mother was murdered, and he tried to use that as some kind of bargaining chip, some reason that this man should be allowed a second chance. But so much was set forth by the deputy district attorney in this case. There was a pathologist who testified that they found dirt in Nikki's lungs, and I was stunned when I heard that because I was thinking that after all that time passed, her organs wouldn't even be there after decomposition. That led me to conduct some very questionable Google searches, but apparently there are ways to tell. Even if they couldn't, these men admitted she wasn't dead when they dropped her into that grave. Now, they weren't actually able to tell the cause of death because of how decomposed Nikki's body was, so that's why it was a little confusing to me whether or not they were able to tell where the dirt came from. Because if a person is put in a grave and they're covered with dirt, that made me a little bit confused. But in my opinion, if the court accepted this testimony to be reliable and this expert witness was qualified, then I'm going to assume that their testimony was truthful and that there was a way that this could be determined. So the judge concluded that this was premeditated in every sense of the word. It was cold-blooded, and that Craig would still be a danger to others if he was released from prison in the future, because he was, in her words, dysfunctionally susceptible to the influence of others. I had never heard it put that way, but yes, indeed, he was. This is peer pressure to another level, and he didn't even need to be pressured. He was asked, and he complied. Craig Whiting was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nikki's mother, Robin, sobbed through the whole sentencing hearing, and then she turned and hugged her family. Once it was over, she was so happy that Nikki could finally rest in peace, and she thanked the deputy district attorney for all that she had done. The family didn't know that Nikki was buried alive until that hearing. It was so hard to hear, especially for a loved one, because even for me, to imagine that horrific image in my mind of Nikki's final moments and how scared she must have been. In other cases, I've actually heard people say that it's a good thing if a victim is drugged or they're unconscious, they don't know what's happening. But honestly, either way, this is heartbreaking. The family was glad that it was over, that these two men would never see the light of day. Amanda said that maybe now she could go back to college after she declined that full scholarship back in 2004 when Nikki was still missing. I just hope that somehow this family is able to find some peace, and I'm so sorry for everyone in Nikki's family and all of her loved ones. A fierce wildfire in California uncovers a charred cabin that has been completely destroyed. A family is unaccounted for, and investigators are searching for clues. You'll be amazed at how they eventually crack this case, so keep watching. The unfortunate events in this case take place in the town of Greenwood, California, in September of 2015. Greenwood had a very tight-knit population of only about 1,000 people. It was a quiet, peaceful little unincorporated community about 50 miles northeast of Sacramento in El Dorado County. Greenwood is described as safe and rural. It has a lot of trees and forestry, and a lot of the houses there are used as vacation homes for people from down south or in the San Francisco Bay Area. But what you may or may not know about California forests is that they can be the setting for the type of story that we usually see on I Survived. And that is because there is the looming threat of wildfires, and they can break out without notice. With this in mind, on the morning of Sunday, September 13th, 2015, El Dorado County 911 dispatchers received a call of a possible vegetation fire. Since forest fires can become a community-wide deadly disaster if not addressed rapidly and distinguished as fast as possible, firefighters responded immediately to this scene. Once they were there, what they saw was horrific enough. The flames of this inferno were visibly estimated to be as high as 100 feet tall. Despite how potentially dangerous this fire could be and how far it could spread, it was located in an area that had a creek behind it. So a lot of times when a fire is in an area where there is a body of water, it can help to contain it and even suppress it. And luckily, that is what happened. Firefighters were able to successfully corral this fire, and it consumed 3 acres of land. That is 3 football fields of land, which isn't a little amount of land. But the potential for this fire to be so much more widespread was very high. It only affected and consumed one structure. It was a 600 square foot structure. Here are some photos of what was left. Fires just get out of control so quickly, and they destroy everything in their path, and this building was a total loss. It was burned to the ground. Along with firefighters located on the scene, law enforcement officers were also dispatched to help assist where they could. And they did this as the fire department took the lead on suppressing this fire and to examine what was left of the smoldering structure. Unfortunately, it was way too hot to get close to it to examine exactly what it was, so they had no choice but to process the scene from the furthest point inward. Because of how hot it was, firefighters are putting their lives at risk. So this type of scene is different because you have the potential of the actual officials and the authorities being harmed as well. And that could lead to even more of a catastrophe. So they are advised and actually commanded to stay away. Officers were visually inspecting the completely burned down structure from a safe distance in the beginning stages, trying to figure out who the owner of the property could be and inform them of what transpired. While they were visually inspecting and kind of walking around where they could, that's when one of the investigators started to smell something. They picked up on this scent, and it was this sweet smell, and they couldn't exactly place what it was. But as they continued to inspect what was left of the structure, it finally clicked. The smell was actually flesh. It was burnt flesh. When you work in this type of environment for so long, you have the unfortunate fate of encountering victims whose lives were claimed by these infernos. When both the firefighters and law enforcement officers all reached a consensus that that very specific smell could be none other than of something that was once alive and had been burned by this wildfire, a search began. Now to find possible victims. But at the same time, they can't rule out wild animals either, so it was tough. Since the investigators were restricted in where they could actually search due to the high temperatures, as I mentioned, still emanating from this burned structure. But of course they continued their search where they could do so safely. At the top of the driveway they found a 2-axle trailer as well as an old Dodge work truck. The truck only had one area to sit up front, and I'm going to show you it here. So this could possibly fit about 2 adults comfortably, maximum 3, but that would be a really tight fit. So they're just analyzing, who could have come here. Did they take this truck? How many people potentially were in the cabin, if there were any? They were really trying to figure out whether anyone had been in the cabin when it had been burned down. They ran the plates, and the truck belonged to a company called Buchanan Construction out of Benicia, California, which was about 3 hours from Greenwood. The investigators called Benicia Police Department, and they asked them to find out more information about who owned Buchanan Construction. That's when they made their very first connection, and that was with a 38-year-old man named Adam Buchanan. Police went over to Adam's home, and when they arrived, they took note of a white Ford F-150 truck in the driveway. When they knocked on the door, the only person that was home was a boy. He was a 16-year-old boy named Nolan Buchanan. They asked him, "Are your parents home?" And he told police they were not home, but he had expected them to be home sometime Sunday evening. He wanted to know what was wrong, why the police were there, but the police didn't want to alarm Nolan because they didn't have ample information. Plus, they were not in charge of the case, they were merely gathering information for the Greenwood Police and Fire Departments. When the police asked where his parents were, Nolan explained his dad owned the construction company, and they had recently purchased a second home. It was a cabin out in Greenwood. They would go out there pretty often to complete remodels and renovations on it. And that's where his dad went with his fiancée that weekend, following a birthday party celebration they had for Nolan's half-brother, their 8-year-old son Gavin. They let Nolan stay at home because he wanted to go somewhere with his girlfriend. All of this information was relayed to Greenwood PD as they tried to shield Nolan from any further details of the incident until they could complete a thorough investigation. But of course, like any son, he wanted to know why the police were asking all these questions about his family. They explained that there was a concern in Greenwood, and they would update him as soon as possible. When this information was given to Greenwood Police Department, they now knew who owned the cabin that had been reduced to ash. On Monday, September 14th, 2015, Greenwood officers began to make that 3-hour trip to Benicia to gather even more information. They needed to connect the dots, and they called everyone they could to help find out more information about Adam Buchanan. First, they called his company, where employees gave them both Molly and Adam's cell numbers. Molly is Adam's fiancée. It turned out that neither one of their phones had been active for the last couple of days, and that did not look good. Something had happened, and they just had to figure out what. Where was Adam? What happened to the Buchanan family? They decided to stop by Adam's company, and there were a lot of employees there who could try to fill in the gaps about Adam and his family. After that, they were given the contact information for Adam's mother and father, Howard and Susan Buchanan. When the police told his parents what happened, they were shocked that the cabin had burned to the ground, and obviously, they were very concerned. They knew that their family went there all the time to renovate this cabin, and they knew they were probably there if they weren't to be found at their home. They wanted to know where their son was and whether their family was okay. But again, the police did not want to jump to any conclusions. They were just there to gather information. They needed to know the layout of the cabin. They asked if there were any pictures or floor plans because they wanted to get an understanding of where all the rooms were. The parents gave them as much information as they could about the cabin, and Howard explained it was under construction, that Adam would go up there often, and he was in the process of figuring it all out. And though Adam's parents were concerned about their family, the police had to keep their focus on this fire. They needed to understand how it could have started. They asked whether there were electrical issues that they knew about because of the construction, whether there were generators on the property. They just wanted to get an overall idea of whether this could have happened on accident. They also wanted to know more about Adam Buchanan. He said that growing up, Adam was a happy child. He was vibrant. He was always joking around, smiling, having a good time. He had twin brothers, Andy and Matt, as well as a brother, Eric, and a sister. He loved to work with his hands, and he was always trying to figure things out, put things together, take them apart. So it's no surprise that he gravitated towards construction. He did end up getting married quite young, and the couple had Nolan, who is now 16. But that relationship just didn't work out, and it ended in a divorce. Adam ended up getting custody of Nolan, and they were best buds. Adam did as much as he could for his son. He was a present father. He was always trying to make a better life for them. So as Adam's construction business grew, he was planning to hand it over to Nolan one day. Nolan began learning the ropes when he turned 12 years old. As much as Nolan wanted to take the business seriously, he wasn't as good at picking up things like Adam was. But as he began to follow his dad around, he learned how to run the business from day to day, and it was pretty exciting. He was taking it all on as a future owner, and the business had even been switched recently from Buchanan Construction to Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. Howard explained that his grandson got along great with Adam and that they worked well together. Adam was engaged to a 37-year-old woman named Molly McAfee. Police now had another person to look into. They were able to track down Molly's mother, Susie, and she explained that she actually had Molly pretty young. She had just graduated from high school a week before Molly's birth, and they were very close. It was like they actually grew up together. Molly also had 3 younger brothers, Brett, Brandon, and Matthew, as well as a younger sister, Rachel. Molly was a beautiful baby, and she grew into a beautiful woman. She was very rebellious as a teen, and the one thing she was seeking more than anything was that perfect man that could love her unconditionally. And she finally found him when she met Adam. Molly and Adam met on a dating site 10 years before this, and they talked for a little while before they ended up going to Starbucks. Then they headed over to the gun range because they both had an affinity for hunting. They really clicked, especially because Molly had administrative experience in the construction industry. They were love-struck right away. Their passion was completely undeniable. They were so in love that things were moving very fast, and it wasn't long before Molly was living with Adam and Nolan, who was only 6 years old, in a house that Adam had just bought. It was a brand new house in Venetia, and now they had a little built-in family of their own. But Molly longed to be a mother to her own child. She wanted that experience. She wanted to carry her own baby, and especially because she had had a number of miscarriages over the years, and she was devastated thinking that maybe it wasn't in the cards for her. But to everyone's joint surprise, she did end up getting pregnant with Gavin. Gavin was the light of her life. He was the cutest baby. He had these big blue eyes and blonde hair and this cute little smile and a lovely personality to go with it. Just look at him. He is adorable. He loved playing with his big brother and his cousins and friends, and his grandma Susie said he had quite the imagination, and they knew he would grow up to do amazing things. He was a very old soul. Soon Adam proposed to Molly, and the Buchanan family was closer than ever. Nolan even called Molly Mom. Molly, Adam, and Nolan even worked together at Buchanan and Sons Construction. At this point, investigators that are back on the scene inform these officers that they found clues that someone had definitely been in the cabin. There were bags of fast food trash by the cabin's adjacent fire pit. Here's a police photo, and it looks to be a Taco Bell bag. Seems like the most likely scenario was that Adam, Molly, and Gavin had gone up to the cabin like Nolan had said. Now they needed to know where they were, and they were about to find out. On day 3 of the search, they could finally get into the structure. It had cooled to a safe temperature, and a portion of it, so they sifted through that portion of the ash. That's when they came across something absolutely terrifying. They found what looked like a human skull. As they were able to get closer and sift through, they knew for sure it was because they stumbled upon a partial chest cavity. Since officers now had confirmation that they had a fatality on their hands, criminal procedures indicated that a death investigation had to be initiated. Because a death investigation had now been initiated, the burned-down structure had become a possible crime scene, and it had to be preserved. They had to do this in hopes that they could reveal the real story of what happened. El Dorado Sheriff's Office detectives were called out to the scene, and they took the lead on this case. Many times in these situations, more often than not, it's a sad scenario where someone could not escape the home in time. Construction was going on here. They did see a propane tank. There's just so many things that could happen, and what they see most is the tragedy where someone is trapped inside. When you got near the rubble, you could still feel the heat coming off of it, and investigators searched where they could, while they avoided the parts that were still superheated. Once again, they stumbled upon more bones. At the time, they didn't know whether these bones belonged to the same individual, but the fact that they were in an entirely different portion of the home made them realize that this is a second set of remains. But they actually couldn't confirm it 100% without walking through the structure because it was still smoldering. Investigators had a growing mystery on their hands, and they had to tally what they currently knew: 20 acres of property, a burned structure, and what they believed to be at least 2 sets of potential human remains, and no explanation of how they died. The El Dorado Sheriff's Office requested crime scene investigators and extra police personnel to the scene, and they began to carefully canvass the 20-acre property. YLA core team investigators and crime scene specialists stayed with the burn structure to process those remains. Photographs were taken of everything as the crime scene personnel carefully looked through the rubble of what could have been the interior of this cabin. They did discover something that made their hearts sink, and that was a 3rd set of human remains. And one piece of this evidence changed the course of this entire case. They were not just dealing with an accidental fire that caused fatalities, because what they were looking at proved that. They were looking at what appeared to be a multiple homicide investigation. So what was this piece of evidence that so significantly redirected their entire investigation from a fire that caused the death of 3 individuals to a full-blown homicide investigation? It was a 5 by 5 centimeter piece of human skull, and right through the center portion of that piece of skull was a perfectly circular hole, which even somebody that was not trained in death investigation or ballistics would know that it was consistent with that of a bullet hole. This was the first real indicator that foul play was present, and that changed everything. But new questions were already forming based on that one piece of skull. Was this a home invasion? Did someone follow this family and take their lives? Whatever the case, the investigators were now potentially dealing with the murder of an entire family. Investigators were moving fast, and they were thoroughly continuing to process this cabin in what appeared to be a giant crime scene. All the evidence was sent to a forensic pathologist for their painstaking work. You know what it's like for them to process all of these bones, put them together in a way that makes sense. It's a really hard job to do, but completely necessary, especially to find justice in these cases. As the story started to unfold, pathologists did find that the first set of human remains had a bullet that was lodged in the hips, and there were fragments of bullets lodged in the spine. The second set of remains had been burned almost to nothing, but they were able to find several shell casings around the remains. And the third set of remains, that person died from a gunshot wound to the head. Some of the things about this picture-perfect family were not so perfect. Police had to interview more of the Buchanan's family members and their friends because they still did not have the identities confirmed, but it made sense that the remains were those of Molly, Adam, and little Gavin. In his very first interview with police, Nolan explained that he did not go to the cabin because 1, there wasn't enough room in the Dodge truck that his parents were taking back to the property, and him and his dog couldn't fit in there. Plus, he had plans to hang out with his girlfriend. Nolan had grown up a lot faster than other boys his age. He was very independent, and his father had no problem trusting him to stay home and watch over the house while they went up to the cabin. He was old enough to drive, and he chose to stay back. They pressed him about how he thought a fire could have occurred. He tried to think of plausible scenarios. He mentioned a theory that his little brother could have caused a fire by tripping over the generator. But then he tells police something significant that piques their interest, and that was about the relationship between Molly and Adam, and that it wasn't a good one. He said that they argued constantly. Now that investigators' interest is piqued, they want to go and find more personal information about the couple, so they track down and interview Molly's mother. Molly's mom explained that sometime in the past 10 years, no one is sure exactly when, things did start to go downhill a bit between Molly and Adam. Friends and relatives that were close to the couple witnessed their frequent arguments. There were times that they wouldn't even speak to one another. Molly would move back and with her mom from time to time. Sometimes she would bring Gavin, and other times Adam was sort of, I don't want to say hold him hostage because it's his son, but he wouldn't allow her to take him. And as a matter of fact, Molly was not welcome at the Buchanan family gatherings anymore. It was just too much for some of the people around them to handle. Molly was described as being unpredictable. There were also accounts that she was using drugs, and on at least 5 separate occasions police were called out to their home because of the arguments between them. By 2015, the couple was fighting on a daily basis. They would call each other names, and they would even throw things at one another. Adam wanted to throw Molly out and to keep Gavin, and I hate when children are in the middle of these adult situations because they are so innocent. They can't choose where their parents are, and for a parent to use that child as a pawn, really. I can imagine what Gavin was going through. Sometimes they would tell Gavin that he would never see his mom again, and other times Molly would walk out and she would claim that she was going to seek custody of Gavin. And this would eventually turn into even worse arguments back and forth. But of course, she would eventually return, and the cycle would continue, and this became a very toxic relationship. They just kept fighting and then going back to one another. Speaking with even more relatives, it started to paint an even more vivid picture of life in the Buchanan household. Nolan got along great with his father, but the tension between him and Molly made him fly off the handle. So there were times that Adam would get irate with Nolan, and he would take that anger out on his son. He would even throw things at him when he was angry. And sometimes these arguments got physical. The one thing that I personally don't like, that was explained by some of the family and friends, was how Nolan would get belittled by his father. A lot of times when they were working together, employees would notice that if Nolan was going a little slower and not as fast, because he wasn't as fast of a learner as Adam used to be. Adam would make him feel like crap. Not everyone learns at the same pace. You're two totally different people. But that just didn't really fly with Adam. He wanted things done the way that he wanted it. However, Nolan was a hard worker, and he wanted to live up to the expectations that his father put on him. And he did become a supervisor of a small crew. Adam's main goal was to teach Nolan everything so that Adam could step back and relax while his son took over everything. And as much as Nolan wanted to make his father proud, he dreamed of something else. He wanted to enlist in the army. It was just one of his goals, but that didn't align with what Adam wanted. Both Molly and Adam would talk with Nolan about their problems with each other. Again, this is super hard, especially for a young child. We don't know when this started. He was only 6 years old when they got together. It's hard on Nolan because he's loyal to his father, and then he starts to begin to find Molly intolerable. He would just try to tolerate her for the simple fact that his dad refused to break things off. Plus, Molly was Gavin's mama, and Nolan loved his little brother. He would babysit him all the time whenever Molly and Adam wanted to go out, and mostly it was when they wanted to go out to drink at the bar. Nolan did his very best to shield his brother from all the arguments that were going on between the parents. There were also accounts from friends and family that Adam was having affairs with other women, and that he was still carrying on one of the relationships. In August of 2015, when they tracked that person down, she explained that Adam would describe Molly as a bizarre woman, but he did say that they were working everything out in the relationship. And maybe that's why they decided to get this cabin in Greenwood, California, as a getaway. And they had recently been putting a lot of work into it. They were renovating the inside and remodeling each and every room, and it was very pretty. Finally, after having suspicions of who the identities of the 3 sets of human remains were, investigators received confirmation from the Department of Justice Crime Lab that the identities of the remains were, in fact, Adam, Molly, and Gavin Buchanan. Where was this unfolding story now taking investigators? They were wondering if this could be the tragic story of someone taking their family's lives and then taking their own, or whether it could involve something with Adam's business and it being a home invasion. Investigators acknowledged that they would not be able to confirm what happened to the Buchanan family until they found a weapon, either in or around the victims where they were located within the structure, or they could confirm with absolute certainty that the weapon was not located at that property at all. And I think you know why, and I'm going to explain it for those that might not be putting it together because, all this can be kind of confusing and fast-paced. Investigators knew that it was really important that they find even the slightest bit of a fragment of a firearm. If a firearm was found, then investigators would point in the direction of a potential murder-suicide. But if there wasn't a firearm, this meant more likely than not there was a suspect that wasn't accounted for. Again, police had the task on their hand that they didn't want to undertake, but they had to because it was part of their jobs. They now had to notify the families of the devastating news that their loved ones were in fact deceased. And that's hard. As investigators, you're there to serve your community, but more importantly the victims, to be their voice and to help put their story together to seek justice. It's difficult when you have to balance the interest that you are a public servant with the interest of loved ones with so many questions, especially when you have no answers. And it's a very emotional situation. When Adam's mother and father were notified, you can imagine it was absolutely devastating. Howard couldn't believe that he just lost 3 members of his family, and the entire family was erased. They were taken away forever without warning, without being able to say goodbye. And he just wanted to know how this happened. Molly's mom had to be notified over the phone, and that's devastating to me because they can't comfort her. She can't look anyone in the eye. There's not that human connection, and she could not believe it. She was in complete shock. She just threw her head back. She was crying hysterically. Even though she knew it was real, she wished it wasn't because it is beyond heartbreaking. You never imagined anything like this is going to happen to you or your child. Molly's mom wanted to be as helpful as possible, even though it was hard to sit there and be level-headed and give police as much information and as truthful as possible when you just found out that you'll never see your daughter. You will never hold your daughter again. You want answers. You want justice. You want closure. So even as sad as she was about Molly, she had to be strong and give them information. She said that she sometimes worried about Molly because she was afraid that either Molly or Adam would end up killing each other. They were both into hunting, so she would always be concerned anytime they would go anywhere, in the mountains or anywhere alone, thinking they have guns. What if they start fighting? Then police had to ask that very personal question about Molly. They wanted to know if she had ever attempted self-harm, and Susie confirmed she had. There were so many ways that this tragedy could have played out. Over the course of the next 5 days, police started to process the entire scene. It was this heaping mass of ash and debris all the way down to the bare floor. They had to go sifting through till they got to the foundation, and no weapon was found. They knew with certainty that Adam, Molly, and Gavin had been killed, and that the person who did it was still out there, with a suspect who could have annihilated an entire family walking the streets. Investigators began to look into the personal lives of Adam and Molly even more, focusing on the possibility that someone they associated with would go to such an extreme measure to commit this heinous crime. But why? Investigators reached back out to Nolan, who by this time was now staying with his grandma and grandpa. And Nolan's account of that weekend was that his family had gone to the cabin, driving the Dodge work truck that we had seen at the scene. It's right here, and that was being used to haul rock up there to put on the outside of the cabin. When investigators asked Nolan about possible issues, whether, was with neighbors or anyone they associated with, Nolan remembered something. There was a neighbor next to the cabin that was growing marijuana, partially on the Buchanan's property, and that was a problem. Investigators knew that there was actually a large marijuana operation, and with these operations came violence in the form of those trying to protect their grow operation with anyone that was attempting to either steal it or alert authorities. These crimes in the area of Greenwood were not unheard of, and over the years, there were several homicides that were associated with marijuana grow operations and locations. When they interviewed Adam's family, the family also confirmed what Nolan said. They said that there was marijuana found on the Buchanan property, and that Adam found out that this was being grown on a segment of his property. And he immediately, without hesitation, went to the neighbor and confronted them. He knocked on the door and he told them, "Look, I'm going to be back next week, and by next weekend, I want all of the marijuana gone off my property, otherwise there's going to be trouble." And he told them, "I'm going to call the police." Nolan at this time was trying to hold everything together. He told the officers he was trying to do his best to be brave, and that he was trying not to break down. And I think that there is definitely a stereotype still about boys that show emotion, that it's weak, but there are moments when crying is appropriate, that letting out your emotions is the healthiest thing that you can do, especially when your parents just died. Even if it's a less traumatic situation, it's okay to cry. Nolan held that in, but he gave police as many facts as possible. Could this marijuana grower who felt threatened possibly have hurt Adam and his family, and then set fire to the cabin? They didn't know. Investigators admitted that this theory was definitely not out of the question. It was actually entirely possible. But investigators still weren't sure if the marijuana grower was the right direction to go in to make that their primary focus. On September 18, 2015, the El Dorado Sheriff's deputies also made contact with the houses close to the cabin property to try to figure out who might know anything about the marijuana farm. One neighbor reported the same exact story about Adam confronting the marijuana farm owner, and that person ran Adam off his property, and that seemed to be the end of it as far as that neighbor knew. Investigators also asked the family and friends of the Buchanans if the Buchanan family's business had any enemies. Apparently, the business was struggling, and Adam just had to lay off a handful of employees. They were now down to their lowest staffing level in the history of their company. They only had 5 employees left. As they started to interview more of these employees that had stuck around, Adam and Molly were described as friendly enough, but some of them didn't have such nice things to say about them. They just didn't have a very good relationship with them. Molly's sister, Rachel, said from what she understood, Adam was very particular. He was very hard-headed, and he wanted the company to run a certain way, and it wasn't up for debate. If employees were going to be laid off, it's not surprising that one of them could have been disgruntled. The business was also in debt, and investigators confirmed that it was essentially failing. It was at least $30,000 in debt at this point. If you watch True Crime, you probably know that someone's finances and financial trouble is sometimes one of the biggest reasons that these crimes occur, so they had to look into it. Within this financial deep dive, investigators usually find that the worse a person's personal finances are, or business finances are, the more desperate for a solution these people might become. A search warrant was obtained so that investigators could look deeper into the business and hopefully find out if Adam and Molly had an enemy. There was a lot of work to be done, and investigators got started right away. And in the meanwhile, there was this unrelated, seemingly coastal cleanup going on. It was being done by a local high school, and it was about a mile away from Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. The high school students, I know you've probably been a part of this, they were doing this event where they volunteered to walk up and down, picking up trash and all kinds of other items that had been dumped and discarded along this road. While these students are walking in this area, they find something, a purse that had been discarded in a bush. And get this, guess what they stumble upon right next to the purse? A .22 caliber rifle. The purse and the gun were given to police, and once they were on the scene, they received a surprise that they could never have anticipated. Officers look inside the purse and they find 2 licenses, and guess who they belonged to? They were issued to none other than Adam Buchanan and Molly McAfee. Finding the purse and the rifle was a huge break in this case. Photographs were taken of both of the items and where they were located when they were found, and then they were collected to be analyzed at a later date. Investigators suspected that the person who murdered Adam, Molly, and Gavin at the cabin took the weapon, placed Adam's wallet in Molly's purse, and brought it all back to Benicia, California, and then dumped it with an effort to dispose of the incriminating evidence. But why would they do this a mile away from the family business? Now it's looking like it could be a disgruntled employee, and that was their focus because of where the purse and the gun were found. Investigators thought they had this strong lead that one of the workers that was associated with the business could be that suspect they were looking for, and that's where they headed next. A search warrant was obtained and authorized, and the investigators executed a warrant at the Buchanan family business. They went through the financial records, their computers, they went through all the vehicles, they were all seized, and they examined everything. They wanted to know, did anything happen in the business? Were any of the vehicles used to harm any of these people? What happened? Investigators were able to confirm not only was the business in debt and failing, but they also discovered something that changed everything. There was a video surveillance system, and it recorded the exterior of the building and the parking lot. Investigators knew that the family left on Friday, September 11, 2015 for the cabin. They were hoping they would get lucky and uncover key information from that video. Once they focused on that camera system, they found a specific camera that was pointed straight into the construction area parking lot, right where one of the Buchanan vehicles was parked. They went through the video surveillance recordings for September 11th and found footage of Adam, but not only of Adam and Nolan. They were loading pallets of rock onto the 2-axle trailer. It was found to be unhitched and parked at the cabin. And remember, Nolan explained his dad goes up there, they're doing the exterior, they've got all this rock that they're hauling over there, so you know it's making sense. This was the very same trailer that the investigators were able to pull that registration information off of and connect it to the Buchanan family. So this all makes sense. And in the video footage, the loaded flatbed trailer was then hitched to a vehicle, but it wasn't hitched to the Dodge truck, the one that had been in the driveway of the cabin. It was hitched to the Ford F-150 that was found to be parked in the driveway of the Buchanan family home. It was kind of confusing. Nolan had originally told investigators that the flatbed trailer had been hitched to the Dodge truck. So something wasn't adding up here, because remember, the reason why Nolan said he couldn't go to the cabin was because he couldn't fit into the Dodge truck. The video surveillance footage of September 11th seemed to now be conflicting with what Nolan had originally told them. So now investigators are thinking if that same white Ford F-150 was used to pull the loaded trailer to the cabin as the video surveillance seemed to imply, then someone had to drive that truck back to the home between Friday, September 11th and Sunday, September 13th, or is there missing information? And they're probably thinking Nolan can give them more of what was going on. Did they just load it up there and then drive the F-150 to the house and then drop the F-150 off and then pick up the Dodge, because that seems plausible as well. The implication was there, but investigators needed to find solid proof that they could back up the theory that the Ford F-150 was driven to the cabin in Greenwood and not the Dodge. Then, randomly enough, doesn't that always happen? Investigators received a call from some extended family members that had taken Nolan to lunch that day. I think you know where this is going, but stay tuned, it gets kind of weird. Molly's sister, Rachel, described Nolan's behavior at lunch as somewhat bizarre. Now, let me just say one thing. In these situations, I don't think anyone is trained to act a certain way when something traumatic happens, and everyone wants answers. Family members do tend to turn on other people because they're looking so hard to figure out what happened, and a lot of times, family members are looked at first. Nolan's the only family member left at this point that's directly connected to all three of the victims. But according to Rachel, they sat down to have lunch, and she asked him why he wasn't at the cabin that weekend. Nolan, in her perspective, responded strangely. Instead of giving her a reason, his statement was, "I'm no longer an heir. I am the owner. My father put Buchanan and Sons Construction in mine and my brother's names, and now they're not here anymore, so I am now an owner." That seems so odd. And Rachel was shocked by this strange answer and said, Nolan was talking about how he wanted to get emancipated because now he was the sole owner of Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. You know, because they're gone. So Rachel went on to tell police that she then looked down at Nolan's hands and she saw him wearing these two huge gold rings. And she said, "Where did you get those rings? Were they your father's?" She was thinking, this is a sad moment. He misses his father, he's taking some memorable items, and he's wearing them. But Nolan just says, "No, I just bought these." And then she just told police, he just kept saying, I'm the sole owner, and how he was going to liquidate all the assets to keep the company afloat. Just so we're all on the same page, Rachel concluded the report of the weird conversation by saying, Nolan is 16 years old. What 16-year-old talks about being emancipated and liquidating assets? What 16-year-old is cold-hearted when his 8-year-old little brother is gone? And she thought he did something. Now at this point in the story, when I was reading everything, I kept thinking, Nolan knows his dad's business. He was concerned about his dad's business. If he cared about his father, even though his father's gone, he knew his father's wishes were that he took over the business, and his dad was always proud of him, even though his dream was to enlist in the army. Maybe in his grieving, this was the way he knew how to honor his father. And the fact that this is Molly's sister, it would lead me to believe, as someone looking from the outside, that Molly's sister would lean more toward not thinking that her sister's fiance's family is that great, considering all the fighting and knowing that Nolan wasn't really her biggest fan. But with all these red flags raised, they have to look into Nolan. 2 investigators arrived at the grandparents' home, and they interviewed Nolan at length. They did not tell him about anything that was on that camera surveillance. Instead, they wanted to lock him into his previous statements. The first time they talked to Nolan, they didn't really get into many of the details of what he did that weekend. However, in the second interview, he went into a little more detail, and he told investigators he was home alone on Saturday, and then he told them that he was at church with his girlfriend and her family on Sunday. After church, he hung out with some friends, he went to the mall, he took his girlfriend out on a date, and the investigators say, "Well, how did you pay for the dates?" And Nolan told them that Adam had left him with an ATM card so that he could make purchases. This mention of an ATM card and it being located inside the house, they decide to get a search warrant so that they could get the ATM card. And when they go in, the card is exactly where Nolan said it would be. It was on top of a safe, and then it was seized as evidence. In the driveway was that white Ford F-150 truck, and as they looked closer, investigators noticed there was a pretty good amount of brown dirt on the exterior of this truck. The dirt was analyzed, and they found it to be consistent with the soil around the cabin. The investigators seized the truck for evidence. They wanted to gather more evidence that might be present within the interior of the vehicle. Once they received confirmation that Nolan was lying about which truck was taken to the cabin, Nolan immediately became the main suspect of this crime. But before you think this is an open and shut case, there's more. It is really hard for me to comprehend that a 16-year-old could do this to his entire family, including his little brother who he loves and adores. But at this point, it seemed like this is all they had to go on, that the evidence against Nolan was building. Nolan's fingerprints were on that .22 caliber, and again, he is a family member. Could it be that his fingerprints were on it because he's touched it, moved it, been near it? Well, regardless, we've got a match. But investigators still needed to prove the fact that Nolan was at the cabin if they were hoping that this case would hold up in court. Once investigators had that information, it would at the very least eliminate with certainty any other theory about how Adam, Molly, and Gavin were killed. But how were they going to be able to prove that Nolan was, in fact, at the cabin on Friday, September 11th, to Sunday, September 13th? Their efforts were intensely focused now on that bank account and the transactions. Investigators looked at the bank accounts of Adam and Molly and all the transactions in the days before, during, and after that weekend they were at the cabin. The very first transaction on one of the debit accounts was on Friday, September 11th, the day that the family would have gone up to the cabin. And it showed a transaction in Fairfield, California, which is on the way to the cabin. And this was for $36.80 at Taco Bell. And that's a lot to spend at Taco Bell. The investigators went straight to that specific Taco Bell and asked for their video surveillance. And lo and behold, it revealed the Buchanan family was driving the white Ford F-150 in the drive-thru on September 11th at 8:38. So now we definitely have a problem, Nolan. We definitely have a problem. They could also see that the double-axle trailer was being pulled by that Ford F-150, the same one that the rocks are being loaded on, the exact same trailer that was left behind at the cabin that they found on September 13th. Since this Ford F-150 seemed to connect significant events in the timeline, investigators decided to fully search and process the truck for any clues that could substantiate the Taco Bell visit and who might have been in the truck. And this is the part of this case that intrigued me the most. And it might seem kind of like a small thing, but to me it was a pretty interesting connection that they made. Investigators combed through that truck, and when they did, they found a Taco Bell receipt that matched both the total that they found charged to the check card and the date that the truck was seen in the Taco Bell drive-thru. But investigators also found something else when they looked at this receipt that already connected the dots of like, yes, the family was there, and this was the night they went, and this was the amount. They found something so much more significant. The receipt showed that 4 drinks were ordered. 4 drinks? And some might think he was with someone. Again, investigators went back through the evidence that was collected on September 13th, and that's when they found that between the empty drink cups left in the Ford F-150 truck and several Taco Bell cups found at the fire pit, they were able to account for all 4 cups and the type of drinks that were on the receipt. It was now confirmed that the Ford F-150 truck had been at the cabin that weekend. As investigators continued to comb through all of the Buchanan's financial life in the days before, during, and after the murders, a transaction was located that occurred on Sunday, September 12th, for $40 at an ATM that was located at a club. It was called the Valencia Club, and as it turned out, it was a bar that was about 30 minutes away from the cabin. Investigators were sent out to the bar, and they were able to locate video surveillance from there as well, and it showed Molly and Adam inside the bar and their Ford F 150 in the parking lot. Why do they have to keep confirming this? It just sets up more and more evidence, and that's what they're trying to do, build a case. So yes, we already know the Ford F-150 was used and it was in the drive-thru at Taco Bell, but it was also in the parking lot on another day. There was an ATM camera that recorded Adam's transaction, which he withdrew the $40, and this transaction also placed Adam and Molly in the bar a few hours before the fire. When Adam and Molly left the club, video surveillance recorded them driving out of the parking lot. So they are building a timeline. Since investigators knew which route Adam and Molly would take to get back to the cabin and the estimated time it would take them to get back, investigators drove that exact route. They were looking for any businesses that could have video surveillance that could have picked up the couple as they headed towards their cabin. And they found, with a lot of work and effort, a nearby cafe that had video surveillance that was facing the highway that Adam and Molly took. The Buchanan's Ford F-150 was recorded at 2:30 a.m. the morning of Sunday, September 13th, headed toward the cabin. And then as the investigators watched, the same video surveillance footage showed the Buchanan's Ford F-150 passing back by that same cafe headed home. This is when investigators believed that Nolan was driving the F-150, and he left the cabin after getting rid of his own family and setting fire to their bodies. Investigators also found that there were several bank transactions that had been made in Benicia, California, on Sunday, September 13th, that could not have been made by Adam and Molly due to the fact that they were deceased. These charges showed that someone went to Starbucks, McDonald's, and a local gas station. And of course, investigators went to all three to pick up any more video surveillance that they could find. Investigators went to the McDonald's, and they were able to pull up a corresponding receipt and video footage associated with that transaction. And there he was, Nolan Buchanan, in full view, driving his father's Ford F-150. But just to cover all their bases, because the tighter this case was, the better chance they were going to get justice for Adam, Molly, and Gavin, investigators called that Bank of America, the issuer of that very same bank card that Nolan was using, just to make sure that there was only one card issued to that bank account. So there could be no second card with the same account that was used by someone else. And it was confirmed that there was only one card, and that card was being used by Nolan Buchanan. Investigators also now knew that that one bank card had gone up to the cabin and had made it back down to the Buchanan family home. That was the one that was found on the top of the safe, and that ATM card was in Nolan's possession. I want to tell you what happened with everything and Nolan and what he said happened. On October 1st, 2015, investigators interviewed Nolan at his school, and in previous interviews, Nolan had been consistent in saying that the bank card on top of the safe was the one his dad allowed him to use. Investigators, though, were finally able to tell Nolan the truth that they knew for certain, because they pulled that video surveillance and showed Nolan photos and videos of the F-150 in the Taco Bell parking lot on September 11th as it made its way up to the cabin with Nolan, Molly, Adam, and Gavin as passengers. And they asked him, "What do you think this is?" I see as the investigators pointing to the picture, what do you think this is? And Nolan, he's just staring at the picture for 10 seconds. He's just looking at it, maybe trying to come up with an excuse, or maybe he's going to tell them what happened, and maybe he's not guilty. But that's when he responds with, "I don't know what to say," and that's when they put him under arrest. And in November of 2015, charges were formally filed against Nolan for 3 counts of first-degree murder with an enhancement since he used a firearm. Additionally, with as heinous as this crime was, the prosecution filed for Nolan to be transferred from a juvenile court to an adult court, which was granted in 2017. And then this is when Nolan came forward, and he claimed self-defense. And he said that there were issues, and they ranged from emotional to physical altercations at the hands of his own father, and that his father was the real killer of the Buchanan family. Nolan testified that he was in bed asleep. He did go to the cabin, and he was there with his brother. His brother was in a cot right next to him, and he woke up to screaming and gunshots ringing out. He then heard somebody yell "no," and he saw the barrel of a rifle pointed at his brother. He said he saw the gun raise up as his brother was lying in bed, and he was shot 1 time. At that point, the person turned the gun toward Nolan. Nolan said he attempted to wrestle the gun away. He pushed the person back, got the gun, and shot that person twice. And he said the person who shot his brother and then who he shot was his father, Adam Buchanan. Apparently, within the story, Molly was killed first, and she was the person that yelled no. That was what he had kind of put together. At that point, Nolan said he left the cabin and went to the truck and decided to grab some gasoline and light everything on fire in order to make it seem like it never happened. If this happened to your family, why in the world would you add insult to injury and do that to your family? It just doesn't seem sane. Then he says he got into the F-150 and fled, but the prosecution was able to forensically disprove Nolan's story of self-defense. The forensic pathologist from the Sacramento County Crime Lab, they testified on rebuttal that circular hole in Gavin's skull was consistent with a perpendicular shot, the shot that Nolan said Adam made in self-defense. In the animation that the defense created for trial, it would have been at a 45-degree angle, and the hole would have been beveled and more of an oval in shape, but the shot was a circle. And that shot that Nolan described was inconsistent with reality. The investigation into the murder of Gavin revealed that Nolan likely took Gavin's life while he was alone with him, before Molly and Adam even came back from the bar. Then, Nolan waited until they came home, and he ambushed them, and this was based on where Adam's body was located that they concluded Gavin's life was taken first. As for the chain of events after Nolan did this horrific crime to his family, was that he collected the rifle, the purse, Adam's wallet, and brought them with him. He set the cabin on fire and drove back home. Then he turned his phone back on because he had it off, called his girlfriend, went to breakfast at McDonald's, went to church with her, went to the mall, hung out with his friends, and acted like nothing happened. The jury did not buy Nolan's version of the events or the physical altercations that he said he suffered at his father's hands. They only deliberated for 2 hours, and they found Nolan guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. What really happened was that Nolan planned to do this to his family before they left for their trip to the cabin, and he attempted to establish an alibi, manipulate police officers, friends, and family into believing that he was just shocked and grieving when he heard about his family's death, and then he made plans to take over his family's business. Nolan was sentenced to 150 years to life for the murders of Molly, Gavin, and Adam. As for why Nolan committed this horrific crime, investigators believe that his motivation was greed. Family and friends think that Nolan thought that he could run the business better than anyone else, including his father, and he wanted everyone out of his way. He was going to get emancipated, and he was going to run that company on his own. He watched his father for years and thought he was going to live this life of luxury. Would that make a 16-year-old do this to his entire family? Was he some kind of narcissistic sociopath? Was it just greed? Did he just think he deserved everything that his father had built and he just couldn't wait to get it? If this savage family murder wasn't enough to shock you, I want to leave you with this. Nolan Buchanan, even though he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, will be eligible for parole after serving just 25 years in prison. So essentially, this teen could get out of prison in his 40s, still giving him a lot of life to live, even though he took 3 lives from this world.